He walked out of that courthouse with nothing but a 7-year-old girl holding his hand, and every person in that room thought he was finished. His ex-wife took the house, the savings, the trucks, everything. She stood there in a tailored blazer beside her attorney, barely hiding her smile, while Logan Mercer signed his name on one document after another without a single argument. People whispered. They shook their heads. A grown man gutted in public. But outside those courthouse doors, 3 black SUVs were waiting, and the woman stepping out of the first one was about to change everything. If you want to know how a man the world counted out rebuilt something no one could take from him, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The hearing had started at 9 in the morning, and by 11:30 it was essentially over. Logan Mercer sat at the defendant's table in a charcoal gray jacket that didn't quite fit right across the shoulders, something he'd bought at a second-hand store in Bismarck 3 years ago and never got around to replacing. His hands rested flat on the table in front of him, not folded, not fidgeting, just flat. A habit he'd picked up somewhere, the kind of stillness that some people mistook for calm and others mistook for defeat. The courtroom was small by any measure. Fargo's civil division didn't have the high ceilings or the dramatic architecture people imagined when they thought about courtrooms. It was fluorescent lit, slightly too warm, and smelled faintly of old carpet and whatever cleaning product the janitorial staff had used that morning. The wooden benches in the gallery held maybe 40 people. About 30 of them were there. Most had come for Amber. Her family sat in the second and third rows. Her mother, Patricia, in a cream blazer, her 2 sisters dressed like they were attending something celebratory rather than the legal dismantling of a 7-year marriage. They hadn't bothered to hide it, honestly. Patricia Collins had never pretended to like Logan. She'd told Amber at the engagement party that he was too quiet for a man his age, which was her particular way of saying she didn't trust him. That opinion had calcified over the years into something harder, and now she sat in that second row with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who'd been proven right about something she'd always wanted to be wrong about. On the other side of the courtroom, Logan had no one. A coworker from the garage, a stocky Latvian named Janice, who smelled of motor oil and always called Logan brother, had offered to come. Logan had told him not to bother. He'd meant it kindly. He just didn't want anyone to have to sit there and watch. His attorney, a woman named Ruth Campos, who was competent in a thoroughly unglamorous way, sat beside him and kept her voice low. She had done what she could with limited resources against a firm that had clearly spent considerable money preparing this case. Brandon Keller's firm, which also happened to be the firm representing Amber. That conflict of interest had been noted, challenged, and dismissed on procedural grounds 3 months earlier, before Logan had been able to retain anyone good enough to fight it properly. By the time the technical motions were filed, the window had closed. Logan understood what had happened. He understood it clearly. He just hadn't had the bandwidth to do much about it. They're going to call the final asset valuation now, Ruth murmured beside him, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table without looking up from her own notes. When Judge Harmon asks if you have any objections to the amended schedule, you can speak or you can waive. Logan glanced at the paper. The house. The 2019 Ram 1500. The joint savings, $84,000 and change. The boathouse on Stump Lake that he had spent 3 full summers rebuilding by hand. The retirement accounts, even the contents of the storage unit he rented on Route 15, which mostly held woodworking tools and 2 boxes of old photographs. He folded the paper once and set it down. Waive, he said. Ruth looked at him for a second, the way she'd been looking at him for 3 months, like she was trying to find the version of him that would finally get angry. She hadn't found it yet. Logan, we could still contest the... Sophie, he said. She closed her folder. Right. Across the aisle, Brandon Keller leaned down and said something quietly into Amber's ear. She laughed, a short, controlled sound that she immediately suppressed, glancing toward the judge's bench to make sure Harmon hadn't noticed. The judge was reviewing documents and didn't look up. Logan noticed. He always noticed things like that. It was one of the qualities that made him excellent at his work and difficult to live with, or so he'd been told. He looked at Brandon Keller, this tall, well-maintained man in his 40s with the confident posture of someone who had won before and expected to keep winning, and felt something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't hate. Logan had tried hate and found it exhausting. It wasn't contempt exactly, though there was an element of that. It was more like the particular weariness you feel when you watch someone be good at being bad, like watching a con work a room. You could almost admire the craft even as it turned your stomach. He looked away. Duh. The judge's ruling took 40 minutes to read into the record. Logan sat through all of it. He'd read the likely outcome in Ruth's expression weeks ago, the way she'd stopped suggesting alternatives and started using careful language like realistic expectations and outcome management. He wasn't surprised. He'd been preparing himself for this since January. What surprised him was how quiet it was inside his own head while it happened. He'd expected to feel something seismic, some internal cracking, 7 years of his life being itemized and redistributed, the physical evidence of everything he'd built during that time, going to a woman who stood beside the man she'd been sleeping with for the last 2 years of their marriage. And Logan sat there and heard it all, and felt something closer to a slow, deep ache than anything catastrophic. When Judge Harmon reached the custody determination, the room shifted slightly. Logan felt it in the way people sat up, the way Amber's mother leaned forward half an inch in her seat. Amber's attorney, Brandon, technically recused from this portion but hovering nonetheless, had submitted a petition for primary custody with Amber, citing Logan's unstable income and history of extended absences during the previous calendar year. The absences were real. Logan had spent 4 months working remotely on a contract he couldn't discuss, and he had no documentation to present that would explain why without violating a non-disclosure agreement. He had explained this to Ruth. Ruth had done her best. The court finds, Harmon said, adjusting his reading glasses, that the petitioner's claim of primary custody is not supported by a preponderance of the evidence. The respondent has demonstrated consistent and primary caregiving responsibility for the minor child, Sophie Ann Mercer, age 7. Primary physical and legal custody is hereby awarded to the respondent, Logan James Mercer, with defined visitation rights granted to the petitioner. The bench behind Amber erupted in whispered outrage. Patricia Collins pressed a hand to her mouth. One of Amber's sisters said something under her breath that wasn't appropriate for a courtroom. Amber's face didn't crumble. That wasn't who she was. She was too controlled for that, too practiced at a particular kind of composed fury. But her jaw tightened, and the hand on the table in front of her curled into something that stopped just short of a fist. Logan exhaled slowly through his nose. Just once. Then he thanked Judge Harmon in a voice that didn't waver, gathered the papers in front of him, and stood up. Ruth touched his arm. "Logan, I'm fine," he said. "Thank you, Ruth. You did everything you could." She looked like she wanted to say something else. She didn't. He walked out. The November air in Fargo hit him like a correction. Cold, clean, the kind of gray sky that pressed down low and turned everything below it into silhouette. Logan stood on the courthouse steps for a moment and just breathed it in. He could hear people inside, voices. The shuffle of someone following him out, probably Amber's family wanting the last word or wanting to make sure he saw something on her face as she left. He didn't turn around. He was looking at the parking lot. 3 black SUVs sat in a row near the far edge of the lot, engines running, exhaust drifting up in the cold. Not courthouse vehicles, not law enforcement. The windows were tinted dark enough that he couldn't see the occupants from here, but he didn't need to. He recognized the plates on the lead vehicle. Sterling Aerospace, Nevada registration. Something in his chest shifted. Not dramatically, not like a door swinging open. More like a lock you've been ignoring for a long time, suddenly clicking. He'd expected this call eventually. He'd just thought he'd have more time. The door of the lead SUV opened, and a woman got out. Olivia Sterling was 30 years old and moved like someone who had stopped worrying about whether people were watching her. Not arrogance exactly. More like a person who had so thoroughly accepted the space they occupied in a room that the performance of it had become unnecessary. She was wearing a dark coat, no visible jewelry, her dark hair pulled back without much ceremony. She looked cold. She didn't seem to mind. She stopped at the bottom of the courthouse steps and looked up at him. "Logan." "Olivia." A pause. She glanced at the courthouse doors behind him, then back. "How'd it go?" "About how I expected." She nodded slowly, processing something she clearly already knew. "Sophie?" "With me." He paused. "She's at school." I'm picking her up at 3. I know. Olivia put her hands in her coat pockets. The wind moved a strand of hair across her face, and she let it. I have a car waiting to take you both to the airport. Logan looked at her for a long moment. He descended 2 steps, putting himself closer to eye level with her. Both. Sophie comes with you. That's not negotiable from our end. It was never going to be. She held his gaze. We've had a suite arranged for 3 weeks. 2-bedroom, school enrollment already researched for the district. We're not asking you to choose. He turned and looked out at the parking lot again, at the SUVs, at the ordinary cars parked around them, ordinary Fargo residents going about their ordinary Thursday. A woman loading groceries into a minivan 40 yards away, completely unaware that the man standing on these courthouse steps had just lost everything he owned and been offered an entirely different world in the same hour. The turbine project, he said. It wasn't really a question. It's going to fail without you. We've had 3 engineers on it in 2 years. None of them understand the compression architecture the way you designed it. She paused. The way your wife designed it. He was quiet for a moment. The grocery woman finished loading, got in her van, drove away. You could have called, he said. I did call. 6 times over the past 14 months. Olivia tilted her head slightly. You let it go to voicemail. I know. I came in person because we're out of time. She said it without accusation, just fact. The board is meeting in 3 weeks. If I can't show them functional progress on the turbine compression system, they're going to sell the project to Hartwell Defense. It'll be weaponized. Everything Elena built. Don't. His voice came out harder than he intended. He pulled back slightly. I know what the stakes are. Olivia didn't flinch. She just waited. The courthouse door opened behind him. He heard Amber's voice, her telling one of her sisters something, the tone bright with vindication. And he heard the pause that happened when they came outside and saw him standing at the bottom of the steps, talking to a woman beside 3 black SUVs. He didn't turn around. 3 o'clock, he said to Olivia. I picked Sophie up at 3. We can be at the airport by 4:30. Something in Olivia's expression changed. Not relief exactly, but the release of a tension she'd been carrying quietly. We'll be ready. He nodded once and walked toward the parking lot, hands in his jacket pockets, and didn't look back at the courthouse or at the woman standing on its steps in a cream blazer wondering what exactly she was watching unfold. Eleanor Briggs. Elementary sat at the end of Maple Line, one of those aggressively cheerful school names that made no geographical sense in November. And Logan had been parking in the same spot in the pickup line since Sophie started 1st grade. 2nd row from the back, driver's side, next to a light pole that had a sticker on it that Sophie had put there herself during a brief phase when she was very committed to butterfly stickers. He'd never removed it. He liked having a landmark. He sat in his 2009 Tacoma, which, he noted with some irony, was the one vehicle the settlement had somehow not reached, largely because it had been in Janice's name for the past 8 months during a paperwork situation, and watched the school doors and thought about Elena. He did this sometimes. Not all the time. Not in the way people did early in grief, where the absence was a raw physical thing. It was quieter now, 3 years later. More like a habit, a checking in. Elena Mercer had been the most methodical engineer he'd ever known, and he'd known some excellent ones. She'd designed the foundational compression architecture for the turbine project herself. 14 months of work, notebooks full of calculations in her particular tight script, models built and rebuilt on the kitchen table while Sophie toddled around the apartment floor eating cereal out of a cup. She'd been so specific about it, so careful. She used to say that engineering wasn't about being smart. It was about being honest, about the physics, about the limitations, about what you wanted the machine to do and what the machine actually wanted to do. She'd died before they could build the first physical prototype. Logan had walked away from the project 6 months after the funeral. Sophie was 4. He'd had no interest in the world that engineering existed in anymore, the money and the stakes and the politics of it. He'd wanted something simple, something he could do with his hands and bring home a paycheck from, and then be present for his daughter in the evenings without carrying the weight of a billion-dollar project on his mind. He'd become a mechanic. He'd been good at it. He'd been, in a way that surprised him, almost content. Amber had come into his life 2 years later, a systems administrator at a hospital, practical and organized, funny in a dry way that he'd appreciated. He hadn't loved her the way he'd loved Elena. He'd known that going in. He thought she'd known it too, and that maybe she was okay with it because she wasn't looking for that particular kind of love either, just someone steady and present. He'd been wrong about what she was looking for. The school doors opened and Sophie came out. 7 years old with a lavender backpack and Elena's exact way of moving, slightly off-center, like she was always turning to look at something just out of frame. She had a smear of what appeared to be red paint on the back of her left hand and a serious expression that dissolved completely when she spotted the Tacoma. She ran. Logan got out of the truck because he always got out of the truck when she ran. She hit him at full speed and he absorbed it, lifting her off the ground in a motion so practiced it was automatic, one hand on her back, her arms locking around his neck. "You weren't there this morning," she said into his collar. "I know. I had to go somewhere. I told you last night, Bug. I know you told me." She pulled back to look at him, taking his face in her small hands and turning it slightly left, then right, the way she'd done since she was small. He'd never been able to explain it to anyone. She just looked at him when she was worried, examined him, like she was checking for damage. "Are you okay?" "Yeah." He meant it. "I really am." She studied him for another second, then apparently accepted this and wriggled to be put down. He set her on the pavement and she hitched her backpack up on one shoulder. "So are we going home?" Logan looked at his daughter, this person who had his last name and Elena's eyes and something entirely her own in the way she navigated the world, slightly tilted, always looking, and felt the full weight of everything he was about to tell her. "Not exactly," he said. "I need to tell you something, and then I need to ask you something, and then we might be going on a plane tonight." Sophie stared at him. "A real plane?" she said. "A real plane." She looked away, processing, then back at him. "Are we coming back?" "Yes." He crouched down so they were level. "We're coming back. This is still home. But there's something I need to go help with, and I want you with me, and it's going to be a little different for a while." She was quiet for a moment, then said, in a very deliberate voice, "Does this have something to do with the black cars that were outside the courthouse when Mom texted Aunt Kelsey that you were embarrassing yourself?" Logan blinked. Sophie looked at him with the patient expression of a child who had been very carefully listening to adult conversations for her entire life. "Your mom," he said carefully, "was at the courthouse today. She texted Aunt Kelsey. I saw when she was picking me up last week." Sophie shifted the backpack again. "She said you didn't have a lawyer good enough to fight back. Are we going somewhere because you're fighting back?" He looked at his daughter, this small, perceptive, slightly paint-stained person, and felt something move through him that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite pride and was probably something in between. "We're going somewhere," he said, "because someone needs my help. And it's important. And I've been hiding from it for long enough." Sophie considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Okay," she finally said. "Can I bring Rabbit?" "You can absolutely bring Rabbit." She took his hand and they walked to the truck. The garage was called Mercer Auto, which had felt like a natural name when he opened it and felt slightly ironic to him now as he walked through it one last time in the early afternoon light. Janice standing in the middle of the floor, watching him with the expression of a man who understood more than he was saying. The garage was not beautiful. It had 3 lifts, a parts inventory that Logan had spent 2 years organizing into a system only he fully understood. Walls covered in the particular grime that good mechanical work accumulates over time, and a radio in the corner that played classic country and couldn't be changed because Janice had fixed it to that station during a slow Tuesday, and it had become a point of principle. Logan walked the length of it slowly, running his hand along the tool chest he'd bought secondhand and outfitted himself. His hands knew this place. The muscle memory of this work, the way his body oriented itself in this space, it was something, actually. It wasn't nothing. "So," Janice said, "you're going." "For a while." Janice made a sound that was not quite agreement. He was a man of 50-something who had come to North Dakota from Riga 20 years ago for reasons he described as complications and had never fully elaborated. He fixed cars with a competence that bordered on art, and he had never, in Logan's experience, pretended things were other than what they were. "This Sterling woman," he said, "she the one who called the past year?" "Yeah." "You always look different after those calls." Janice crossed his arms. "Not bad different, just like you were carrying something extra. Logan didn't answer. He stopped at the bench near the back window and looked at the aerial photograph of the Sterling campus pinned there. Something he'd printed out 2 years ago and told himself was just reference material. He'd never been able to throw it away. "The project's in trouble," Logan said. "If I don't go back, 3 years of engineering work gets sold to someone who'll use it for things it was never designed for." He paused. "Elena's work." Janice was quiet for a long moment. "Then you go," he said. Logan turned. "I'll sign the shop over to you. I meant to do it 6 months ago." Janice raised one large hand, shaking his head. "You keep it. You come back, we run it together. You don't come back," he shrugged. "Then we talk." Logan looked at this man who had shown up for work every morning for 3 years and never asked about the past and never expected anything except honest work done well, and felt an affection for him that he didn't have the vocabulary for. He extended his hand. Janice shook it once, firmly. Then he walked back toward the lift and the car he'd been working on before Logan arrived, and he didn't look up again, which was the most considerate thing anyone had done for Logan all day. He had one stop before the airport. The aviation hangar at Bismarck Municipal Airfield had been in Logan's family for over 30 years. His father had started it, then the company had grown out of it, and even after everything had expanded and moved elsewhere, Logan had held on to the building. He paid the lease out of the mechanic's income, which was tight, because some things you don't let go of. He'd been out here twice in the past year, both times for maintenance reasons. He told himself he wasn't keeping it out of sentiment. He'd been lying. The locks were mechanical, a specific sequence he'd implemented himself, and they opened cleanly. He pulled the large side door and the interior smell hit him immediately. Aviation-grade lubricant, aluminum dust, the particular cool stillness of a building that holds carefully maintained things. He turned on the lights. There were 2 aircraft. Neither was flyable in its current state. Both were ongoing projects, restored slowly over years in whatever spare time he had, which meant their progress could be measured in inches per season. He wasn't there for those. He went to the workbench at the far end. It took him 20 minutes to find what he was looking for because he'd buried it deliberately. Beneath a locked secondary panel, he'd built himself into the back of the bench, behind 2 false drawers and a fire-rated document safe. Not because he expected anyone to know what they were looking for, but because Logan Mercer had learned in the course of building expensive and important things that you protect what matters even when no threat is visible. The notebooks were there. Elena's notebooks. 14 of them, cloth-bound, different colors. She'd bought them in batches from a specialty stationer in Chicago and went through them fast. Logan lifted the top 2 and held them for a moment without opening them. His hands knew the texture of them, the way they knew the tool chest and the Tacoma's steering wheel, and the specific weight of Sophie's small body when she ran at him. He put them carefully into the weatherproof case he'd brought and sealed it. He also pulled a hard drive from the safe. Black, unmarked, the size of a paperback novel. Encrypted 3 ways with a key that existed in only 2 places: the drive itself and Logan's memory. He put it in the case with the notebooks. He stood in the hangar for a moment. He was not fundamentally a sentimental man. He was not a man who gave speeches, even internal ones. But he stood there with that case in his hand and felt the full weight of what he was doing, returning to something he'd walked away from, carrying the last physical traces of a woman he'd loved, with a daughter who had her mother's eyes waiting in a truck in the parking lot. "Okay," he said quietly. To no one, to Elena, to himself. He turned off the lights, locked the door, and walked back to the truck. Amber Collins was sitting in the Range Rover, her Range Rover. The proceedings had been quite clear about that. In the parking lot of the Applebee's on Main when Brandon called. She had the heater running and a glass of water she'd ordered from the drive-thru of a coffee place and hadn't touched. She was looking at a photograph on her phone. Herself and Sophie at the state fair last summer. Sophie mid-laugh on a ride. The sky the particular orange of an August evening that made everything look good. She didn't hate Sophie. She wanted to be clear about that, even just to herself. She'd never hated Sophie. She'd sometimes resented what Sophie represented. The part of Logan that was always somewhere else, always occupied with a grief and a love that predated her, and that she had never, despite 2 years of trying, been allowed into. That was the truth of it. The truth she'd told herself when she'd started spending extra evenings at the office, where Brandon had an office adjacent to hers. She had a reason. It wasn't a good reason, but it was real. You saw the cars, Brandon said when she answered. 3 SUVs. Sterling plates. She paused. You know what that is? A silence. Then, it's a company. It's nothing. Brandon. Her voice was flat. What is it? She's a client, Amber. One of dozens. I handled some contract paperwork for her firm last year. The woman knows how to make an entrance. Those weren't entrance cars. Amber stared at the photo of Sophie. Those were "we've been waiting" cars. Brandon made a dismissive sound, but she heard something underneath it that she'd gotten good at recognizing over the past 8 months. The slight compression of his voice when he was deciding something. Let it go, he said. He walked out of that building with nothing. You have everything. Just, I have a daughter who chose to live with her father, Amber said. Her voice cracked slightly on the last 2 words. She controlled it. Don't tell me I have everything. The line was quiet. Come to dinner tonight, Brandon finally said. I made a reservation at Labatt's, 7 o'clock. She looked at the photograph a while longer. I'll think about it, she said, and ended the call. She didn't go to dinner. She sat in the parking lot for another 40 minutes, watching a couple walk in and out of the Applebee's with a small kid between them, each holding one of his hands, swinging him forward on the steps, and she thought about the 3 black SUVs and the woman who had stepped out of them. She thought about the way Logan had stood at the bottom of those steps without turning around to look at her. She'd been so certain for so long that she knew who he was. A quiet man who had missed his window, who had stepped back from whatever he'd once been and couldn't find his way back to it. She didn't know why those cars were unsettling her. She didn't know why she felt, for the first time in a long time, that she had made several very large errors. She drove home without calling Brandon back. The private jet was a Gulfstream G55. Oh, and Sophie walked up its steps with the careful reverence of a person entering a museum for the first time. She stopped at the top of the stairs and turned around to look at Logan, who was behind her on the steps. It smells like a hotel, she announced. It kinda does, he agreed. Olivia Sterling was already inside, in one of the cream-colored seats near the front, laptop open, a phone to her ear. She glanced up when they boarded and held up one finger, was, one moment, and continued her call without breaking stride. The call was in German, which Sophie immediately found interesting. She speaks German, Sophie said, not lowering her voice particularly. Apparently. Do you speak German? No. I know some words from a show. Please don't demonstrate. Sophie dropped into a seat with the comfortable lack of self-consciousness that 7-year-olds had in spaces designed for adults, and began examining the window latch with genuine engineering interest. Logan sat across from her and watched her, and felt something that was half gratitude and half the specific brand of terror that parents carry around and don't talk about much. She was okay. She was going to be okay. He had to keep believing that. Olivia ended her call and came back toward them. Sophie, she said, sitting across the aisle. I'm Olivia. I work with your dad. Sophie looked at her with the measuring expression. He said you need his help. I do. He's very good at something I'm not. Mechanics? Engineering, Olivia said. Though I heard he's decent at mechanics, too. Sophie cut a look at Logan. He fixed our neighbor's tractor once. She cried a little. I'd believe it, Olivia said. There was a warmth in her voice that wasn't performed. She'd clearly been around children enough to not be intimidated by them, which Sophie, for her part, appeared to appreciate. Can I ask you something? Sophie considered. Okay. Is there anything you want to know before we take off? About where we're going or what it's going to be like? Sophie thought about this seriously, and the particular way she approached questions she felt deserved real consideration. Will I have my own room? You'll have your own room, Olivia confirmed. Can I bring my fish? Olivia blinked. You have a fish? His name is Gerald. Logan realized he had forgotten about Gerald. He had forgotten about Gerald completely. We'll get Gerald sorted, Olivia said, with only a slight pause. I promise. Sophie nodded, satisfied, and went back to examining the window latch. Logan looked at Olivia. She was already looking at him. Something passed between them that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite the weight of everything that was on the line. Something in between, the way two people who both understand the stakes of something can find a single moment of levity in it without diminishing it. Gerald, he said. We'll get him shipped priority, she said. I'll call someone. He laughed then, a short, real sound, the first one that had come out of him all day. Olivia's mouth curved at the corner. The plane began to move. Logan looked out the window at the flat North Dakota landscape scrolling past. The gray sky, the dormant fields, the distant water tower of a town he couldn't name. He watched it for a long time as the plane climbed. He'd spent 3 years making himself small, making himself manageable, staying inside the outline of a life that fit in a zip code and could be known and understood by the people he worked alongside. He was 32 years old. He had a daughter who was going to be fine. He had a case in the overhead compartment that contained 14 notebooks and an encrypted hard drive and 3 years of someone else's untested genius. He had work to do. The clouds took the ground from him, and he watched them instead. The Sterling Aerospace campus outside Reno, Nevada, was nothing like Logan had expected, which was strange because he'd helped design parts of it. That was the particular dissonance of returning to a place you'd shaped during a different version of your life. The bones were familiar, but the body had changed. The main research complex had expanded since he'd last been here, nearly 4 years ago. 3 new wings, all glass and raw concrete in the style that architects favored when they were trying to signal seriousness. The original building, the one that Elena had spent the most time in, was still there at the center of everything, slightly smaller than its neighbors, slightly older, like a person standing in a crowd of people who are all dressed better. They arrived just past 9 in the evening, Nevada time. Sophie had fallen asleep somewhere over Utah, curled into the leather seat with Rabbit tucked under her chin, and Logan had carried her off the plane without waking her. She stirred once in the car, opened one eye, assessed that Logan was present and the situation was stable, and went back to sleep. He appreciated her efficiency. The suite Olivia had arranged was on the 4th floor of the company's residential building, which was not a hotel in the technical sense but functioned like one, maintained for executives and visiting engineers who needed to be on campus for extended periods. 2 bedrooms, a sitting area, a kitchen that had been stocked with what someone had guessed would be appropriate. There was a box of Lucky Charms on the counter that Logan suspected was Olivia's attempt to account for Sophie. He tucked Sophie in without ceremony, left the lamp on in the hallway at the angle she preferred, and went and stood in the kitchen and looked at the Lucky Charms for a while. It was 10:15. His whole life had rearranged itself in about 11 hours. He made coffee because it was there, and because some habits persist, regardless of the hour, and he stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the campus. The lit pathways, the distant shape of the main hangar, the mountains dark against the darker sky, and tried to locate himself in the sequence of things. The courthouse. Amber's face when the custody ruling was read, Sophie and her butterfly sticker landmark, Janice not looking up, Elena's notebooks in the overhead compartment, a knock at the door, quiet, 3 measured taps. He opened it to find Olivia, still in the same coat, now holding a folder and looking like someone who hadn't considered that it might be too late to knock. I can come back in the morning, she said. You're already here. She came in. She glanced around the suite the way people do when they've arranged a space and want to see if it reads the way they intended. Her eyes stopped on the Lucky Charms. Too much? She said. She's 7, not 5. I didn't know what she ate. She eats everything. She's not picky. He poured a second cup of coffee and held it out. She took it without comment, which told him something about the kind of evening she'd had. They sat at the small table near the window. Olivia opened the folder and set it between them. Inside were photographs, schematics, and 2 dense pages of notes in a typeface too small to read comfortably. Start with the bad news, Logan said. The project is 18 months behind its original development schedule. We lost our lead compression engineer 8 months ago. He took a position with Hartwell, which was not a coincidence. She tapped one of the photographs, an internal shot of what appeared to be a turbine assembly mid-construction. 3 weeks after he left, Hartwell filed a series of patent claims that overlap with Elena's original design in ways that aren't accidental. Logan looked at the photograph. He was quiet for a moment. How much overlap? Our IP attorneys say enough to create a legal challenge that would stall the project for 2 years minimum, even if we ultimately win. Olivia's voice was even, the way people trained themselves to sound even when they were talking about something that was making them angry. But there's a gap. A section of Elena's design that was never documented outside of her personal notes. The compression sequencing logic in the third stage. It exists in her notebooks, but nowhere in the official company filings. Logan understood what she was saying immediately. He felt the familiarity of it, the specific texture of Elena's thinking. She kept it out deliberately, he said. Did she? Yes. He leaned forward slightly. She didn't trust the filing process. She thought the patent system moved too slow and leaked too much during the application period. She documented the core innovation in the notebooks only, with the intention of filing everything simultaneously when the prototype was complete. He looked at Olivia. She told me that was the plan. And the notebooks are here. He glanced toward the bedroom where he'd put the weatherproof case. I brought them. Something in Olivia's posture shifted, not dramatically. She wasn't a dramatic person, but visibly. Like a load-bearing thing that had been holding too much weight suddenly having some of that weight transferred elsewhere. I need you to understand, she said carefully, that if the information in those notebooks is what I think it is, it changes the entire situation with Hartwell. It means their patent claims are built on an incomplete version of the design. The sequencing logic is the key, and if Elena's notes document her development of it prior to the date of their filings, it invalidates their claims. It could, yes. Logan sat back. The coffee had gone slightly cool without him noticing. Outside, the campus lights held the dark at bay with the particular orange glow of high-efficiency LEDs that someone had probably spent a long time specifying. Who knew about the notebooks? He asked. Olivia met his eyes. That's the right question. Who knew? When Elena was alive, you, the two of you, and 3 other engineers who were close to the project. After she passed, Olivia paused, choosing her words with visible care. We weren't sure you'd kept them. We didn't know what state they were in. We had reason to believe, based on some things that have emerged recently, that someone else may have known about their existence. How recently? 4 months ago. One of our security analysts flagged a series of internal queries, someone accessing personnel files related to Elena's project team. The queries were masked, routed through a service account that was supposed to have been deactivated. She turned to the second page of her notes. We traced the activity eventually. It led somewhere unexpected. She put a single sheet of paper in front of him. It was a financial transaction record. Logan could read those well enough to see it was a wire transfer. 6 figures, from a Delaware LLC to a private account. He looked at the name on the destination account. He looked at it for a long time. Brandon Keller, he said. Olivia didn't say anything. She just let it sit there. Logan leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. There was a water stain in one corner that someone had tried to paint over and not quite succeeded. He looked at that stain and understood, with a cold, settling clarity, that his divorce had not been what it appeared to be. He found the hangar, Logan said. We believe so. We think he accessed it. We're not sure when, but based on the timeline of the corporate espionage, somewhere between 8 and 14 months ago. He would have found documentation there, reference materials, possibly early notebook drafts. I kept drafts in the hangar. His voice was flat. Early stage stuff. Not the final notebooks, but enough to understand what Elena had been working on. Enough to identify the value of what he was looking at, Olivia said, and enough to sell it. Logan was quiet for a long moment. Sophie made a small sound in the other room, a sleep sound, nothing wrong, and the silence resettled after it. Amber didn't know, he said. It wasn't a question. He knew Amber well enough to know that she didn't understand engineering well enough to understand what Brandon had found, and more than that, he knew her well enough to know that whatever her failures had been, deliberate industrial espionage wasn't in her. She was angry, and she'd made choices that hurt people, and she'd let a bad man convince her of things. But she wasn't that. We don't believe she knew the specific nature of what was taken, Olivia agreed. But she was used, Logan. The divorce proceedings, Brandon positioned himself to gain access to your financial records, your asset disclosures, anything that would help him understand what you had and where it was. Logan thought about the storage unit on Route 15. On the asset disclosure forms, he'd listed its contents honestly. Woodworking tools and boxes of old photographs. He had not listed the secondary documents in the hangar because the hangar was leased and not a marital asset, and because he had not thought, in the exhaustion of everything falling apart around him, to consider that someone might be using the divorce specifically to find what it contained. He'd missed it. He was a careful man and he had missed it because he'd been too busy holding things together with Sophie and working 60-hour weeks at the garage and trying not to drown. "What does he have?" Logan said. "Specifically, what did he sell?" Olivia pulled out one more sheet. "That's what we need to determine. The buyers, Hartwell's intermediaries, received something. Whether it was enough to actually replicate Elena's sequencing logic or just enough to understand that it existed is the question." She looked at him directly. "That's why the notebooks matter. If we can establish a complete documented record of Elena's work, time-stamped through the development process, we can challenge whatever Hartwell has and determine where the gaps are." Logan looked at the transaction record again. 6 figures. Brandon Keller had looked at 14 notebooks full of calculations written in Elena's tight script, in the building that Logan had maintained for 3 years out of something he'd called practicality and was actually grief, and he'd understood enough to know they were valuable, and he'd sold them. Or tried to. He'd sold what he could photograph or copy. The notebooks themselves were still in the safe, because Logan had built the safe himself, and because he protected what mattered, and because even in the worst year of his life, some habits held. "Okay," he said. He stood up, took the weatherproof case from the bedroom and put it on the table between them. He unsealed it and laid out the notebooks. All 14 of them, different colors, Elena's handwriting on every page, and then set the hard drive beside them. Olivia Sterling, who was a woman who had built a company worth several $billion and who was not typically given to visible emotion in professional settings, looked at those notebooks for a long moment without speaking. "Is this everything?" she finally said. "This is everything." She put her hand on the top notebook and then seemed to think better of it and pulled back. "We should have a proper chain of custody established before anyone handles them. The legal team needs to be involved from the start." "In the morning," he said. "Tonight I need to go through them myself first. I need to know what's there before anyone else does." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because Elena kept shorthand that no one else will fully understand without context. Because some of what's in here is notation that looks wrong and isn't. She had a specific way of documenting a calculation that was still developing. If someone reads these without knowing her process, they'll misinterpret the sequence." He paused. "And because they were hers, and I haven't read them since she died, and I want to do that once before they become evidence." The silence between them was the kind that had weight to it. Not uncomfortable, just full. "I'll have the legal team ready for 9 a.m., Olivia said. She stood, gathered her folder, and left the notebooks on the table. At the door she stopped, hand on the frame, and turned back. "Logan?" She seemed to be picking words carefully. "What you walked away from. The project, the company, all of it. I understood why. I want you to know I understood at the time, even when I was frustrated by it." She paused. "Elena would have finished this. I think that's what you're carrying." He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. She nodded once and left. He locked the door and came back to the table and sat down with the first notebook, the blue one, because Elena always started a new stage with the blue, and opened it to the first page. Her handwriting was exactly as he remembered it. He read for 4 hours. By 2 in the morning, he had confirmed 3 things. The first was that Elena's sequencing logic was complete, documented across notebooks 7 through 11, and was sufficiently distinctive and detailed to establish clear priority over anything Hartwell had filed. The second was that whoever had accessed the hangar and photographed or copied materials there had gotten the early development notebooks, the first 4, essentially the problem-setting phase, but had not gotten anything past the midpoint of Elena's process. They had the premise, but not the solution. The third thing was harder to name. Reading Elena's notebooks was like hearing her think. She wrote the way she talked when she was working through something difficult, quick and precise, then doubling back, then a different approach, marginal notes that were sometimes calculations and sometimes things like "this is wrong," try pressure differential from the other direction, or ask L about friction coefficient, "I'm using the wrong assumption." L was him. He was in those pages in the negative space, the implied conversation partner, the person she'd been thinking aloud to. He sat with that for a while. The campus was quiet outside, He could hear Sophie breathing from the next room, steady and even. He closed the last notebook and sat with his hands flat on the table, the same way he'd sat in the courtroom 10 hours ago, and felt the full weight of what he had and what it meant and what he was going to do with it. Then he made more coffee, because there was still work to do. The morning came in slowly, Nevada style. The light changed outside the window before the sun was visible, the mountains emerging from the dark in increments. Sophie woke at 6:45 with the reliability of a person whose internal clock had been set by years of school schedules, wandered into the kitchen, and stood in front of the Lucky Charms with a complicated expression. "Is this because she thinks kids only eat this?" Sophie said. "Yes." "I can eat it. I'm just saying." She ate 2 bowls while Logan made eggs, and she told him about a dream she'd had involving a horse and a shopping mall and something called the Department of Clouds. And Logan listened and made eggs and felt something that was not quite normal and not quite the opposite of normal, just something he was working out. At 7:30, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "I know what you brought with you. You should know what I found." B. Logan looked at the message for a moment. He put the phone face down on the counter. "Dad," Sophie said, "is your egg burning?" "Yeah." He turned back to the stove. "Thanks." He forwarded the message to Olivia. Her response came in 30 seconds. "Do not respond. I'm calling the attorneys and our security team now." Brandon Keller had sent that message. Brandon Keller, who was in Fargo, North Dakota, which was 1,700 miles away, knew what Logan had brought to Nevada, which meant the hangar had been monitored, which meant the stop Logan had made yesterday afternoon had been watched. He turned this over in his mind while Sophie finished her Lucky Charms and explained the organizational logic of the Department of Clouds. He was not afraid. And he took a moment to honestly assess this, something closer to focused. The thing about a threat is that it has a location. You can work with something that has a location. It was the shapeless things, the quiet erosions, the long year of watching a marriage fall apart in slow motion while you raised a child and drove to work and didn't let yourself name what was happening. Those were the things that ground you down. A specific threat from a specific person was practically a relief. "Sophie," he said, "I need to make some calls this morning. Ms. Sterling arranged for someone to take you on a tour of the campus if you want. There's a simulator lab she mentioned." Sophie looked up from her bowl. "A simulator for what?" "Aircraft, I think." A pause. "Can Rabbit come?" "Rabbit can absolutely come." The simulator lab was housed in the research wing's lower level, and the engineer Olivia had assigned to show Sophie around was a young woman named Priya, who had the gift of treating children like people with actual thoughts, which Sophie responded to with the immediate warmth she reserved for adults who didn't condescend to her. Logan watched them disappear through a set of double doors, Rabbit tucked under Sophie's arm, Priya already explaining something about flight dynamics in the specific vocabulary of someone who had decided a 7-year-old could handle the real information. He turned and walked toward the conference room Olivia had designated, where 3 attorneys and a cybersecurity analyst were already waiting. The meeting ran for 2.5 hours. By the end of it, the notebooks had been photographed, cataloged, and entered into a legal record. The hard drive had been opened by their encryption specialist. Logan provided the key. And its contents, which included 4 years of backup files from Elena's personal research drives, had been transferred to Sterling's secure servers. The cybersecurity analyst, a quiet man named Dwight, with ink on his right hand that suggested a second life as an illustrator, confirmed that the hangar had been fitted with a wireless monitoring device of the type used by corporate intelligence contractors. Logan had not known this. He did not visibly react when Dwight told him. The attorneys spent an hour laying out the legal strategy. The wire transfer connecting Brandon to Hartwell's intermediaries, combined with the time-stamped documentation in Elena's notebooks, constituted enough to bring federal charges. Theft of proprietary technology, industrial espionage, wire fraud. They wanted to move quickly, before Hartwell could modify their patent filings or destroy evidence. They had already been in contact with the FBI's Economic Crimes Unit out of Las Vegas. "What about Amber?" Logan said at some point during the 3rd hour. The room got slightly quieter. One of the attorneys, a woman named Carver who reminded Logan of Ruth Campos but sharper, looked up from her notes. "She's peripheral to the main criminal action. Her exposure depends on what she knew and when." Carver paused. Based on what you've told us and the transaction record we have, she's more likely a witness than a defendant. But that'll be the federal investigators' determination, not ours." Logan nodded. He didn't say anything else about Amber. There wasn't much to say. He hadn't wished her harm going into that courtroom, and he didn't wish her harm now. He just wanted the truth recorded and the stolen things returned and the project that Elena had spent the last productive months of her life building to be completed the way she intended it. After the meeting, he stood in the hallway outside the conference room and let the building settle around him. People moved past. Engineers, assistants, someone pushing a cart stacked with aluminum prototypes. A normal workday in an aerospace company. People solving problems, drinking bad coffee from a machine near the elevator, arguing about specifications in the way engineers argue, which was with great precision and no particular emotion. He had missed this, he realized. Not the money or the influence. The problem solving. The specific pleasure of working on something that pushed against the boundaries of what was known and trying to find the edges. Olivia appeared at his shoulder. "How are you doing?" she said. "I need to see the turbine," he said. "The actual physical build. Whatever state it's in." She looked at him for a moment. "Now?" If there's time, there was time. She took him to the main fabrication bay, a high-ceilinged space that smelled of machined metal and the particular kind of industrial cleanliness that required constant maintenance to achieve. The turbine assembly occupied a central platform, partially shrouded, components in various stages of construction. Logan stood in front of it for a long moment. It was Elena's design given physical form. Imperfect, incomplete, bearing the marks of 3 engineers who had worked on it in the intervening years and hadn't fully understood what they were working with. He could see the errors. He could see, more importantly, where the original vision had been followed faithfully and where it hadn't. He could see the gap, the physical gap, in the compression stage, where the 3rd stage sequencing had never been properly implemented because the engineers working from the official filings hadn't had the full documentation. He reached out and put his hand on the housing, cool aluminum. "This is buildable," he said. Olivia was beside him. "Tell me what you see," he told her. They stood in that fabrication bay for an hour and a half, and he walked her through every section, the parts that worked, and the parts that didn't, and the part that was missing, and how to fix it. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just telling her the truth about a machine the way Elena had taught him, honestly, specifically, without pretending the problems were smaller than they were or the solutions simpler than they were. Olivia listened to all of it without interrupting. She asked 3 questions, all of them good. At the end, she said, "Can you do it? Get us to a working prototype?" Logan looked at the turbine assembly for a long moment, at Elena's design made partial and imperfect and waiting. "Yeah," he said. "I can do it." It wasn't a triumphant answer. It wasn't the kind of thing you said with particular heat or volume. It was just what was true, stated plainly, the way good engineers stated things. But Olivia Sterling had been trying to hear it for 7 years, through 6 unanswered phone calls and 1 very cold courthouse parking lot, and she received it accordingly. "Okay," she said, "let's get to work." They walked back through the fabrication bay, past the engineers who glanced up, and looked at Logan with the careful assessment of people trying to determine what the presence of a new person means for the order of their world. He didn't try to manage their impressions. He just walked and looked at things, and already, in a part of his mind that he'd kept very quiet for 3 years, the architecture of a solution was assembling itself. His phone buzzed. It was Sophie. "The simulator is amazing. I crashed twice, but Priya says that's actually good data." He showed the screen to Olivia without thinking about it. She read it, and for the first time since he'd met her in that courthouse parking lot, she actually laughed. Full and unguarded, nothing professional about it. Just a person finding something genuinely funny. It was, Logan thought, a good sound. He texted Sophie back. "Don't crash a 3rd time. 2 is a pattern, 3 is a habit." The response was instantaneous. A single emoji of a small plane. He put the phone in his pocket and followed Olivia down the corridor toward the conference room and the work that was waiting, the specific gravity of it pulling him forward the way important work always did. Not comfortable, not easy, but true. Outside, somewhere across those Nevada mountains, federal investigators were beginning to pull on a thread that Brandon Keller had left dangling without knowing it. And in Fargo, North Dakota, Amber Collins was opening her laptop and staring at a transaction record she'd found in Brandon's email, one she wasn't supposed to have seen, and feeling the floor shift underneath her in a way she didn't yet have the vocabulary to describe. The transaction record had a timestamp of 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in March, 14 months ago. Amber had found it buried in a subfolder of Brandon's personal email, the one he used for what he called administrative overflow, which she'd had access to for 8 months because he'd given her the password during a weekend trip to Minneapolis when his phone was dead, and he needed her to forward something to a client. She'd never looked through it before. She wasn't that kind of person. Or she hadn't thought she was. She'd gone looking because of the SUVs. She told herself for 3 days that she was being paranoid, that Logan walking out of a courthouse to meet a woman in a black convoy was just Logan, quiet, private Logan, having a life she didn't know about, which was fine, which was his right, which was in fact the entire point of a divorce. She'd told herself it didn't matter. She had the house. She had the savings. She had won, by any measurable definition of the word. But the floor kept shifting. She'd found the email in the subfolder because she'd searched Brandon's address book for the name Sterling, half expecting nothing, and the search had returned 4 emails. The first 2 were routine, a contract consultation, a billing inquiry. The third was a forwarded internal document with a header she didn't recognize, full of technical language she couldn't parse. The fourth was the transaction record, 6 figures, wire transfer. The destination account was in Brandon's name, routed through a Delaware LLC called ArcLight Consulting Group. She didn't know what ArcLight was. She searched it and found nothing. A registered entity with no web presence, no listed officers, incorporated 18 months ago. She sat in her home office now, the room Logan had used as a library, the bookshelves still faintly marked where his books had stood, and looked at the number on that transaction record for a long time. Brandon was a corporate attorney. Corporate attorneys made good money. But this wasn't a retainer payment or a legal fee. The memo line on the transfer read technical consultation, which was not a thing Brandon Keller did. She picked up her phone and put it back down 3 times before she finally called her sister Kelsey. "I need to ask you something," she said when Kelsey picked up, "and I need you to not make it a whole thing." Kelsey was quiet for a moment. "That's never a good opening." "I know. Listen." She pulled up the transaction record again. If someone transferred money to themselves through a company they created and labeled it as a technical consultation, and the company has no actual business presence, what does that mean? A longer pause. Kelsey worked in insurance and understood the architecture of financial concealment the way most people understood weather patterns, well enough to recognize the signs without being able to stop the storm. "Amber," Kelsey said carefully, "why are you asking me this?" "Just answer the question." "It could be a lot of things. Tax sheltering, moving money between accounts for legitimate reasons with a business wrapper." Another pause. "Or it could be someone routing a payment they didn't want traced directly back to themselves." Amber said nothing. "Whose account is it?" Kelsey said. "I need to think," Amber said, and hung up. She sat with it for another hour. Then she picked up her phone again and called a number she'd deleted after the divorce proceedings but hadn't quite forgotten. Ruth Campos answered on the 3rd ring, sounding slightly surprised. "This is Amber Collins," Amber said. "I know this is unusual. I need to ask you something that isn't about the case we just finished." "Ms. Collins, I represented Logan in—" "I know who you represented. I'm not calling about that." She looked at the transaction record on her laptop screen. "I'm calling because I think I may have found something, and I don't know what to do with it. And I can't call Brandon about it, for obvious reasons, and I don't have my own attorney for anything except the firm he recommended, which I'm starting to understand was a problem." Ruth Campos was quiet for a long moment. In the background, Amber could hear what sounded like a television, a normal evening being had by a person with a normal evening. "What kind of something?" Ruth finally said. Amber told her about the transaction record. She read the key details, the amount, the LLC name, the memo line. She mentioned the Sterling name in the earlier emails. She described the technical document she'd only partially understood. When she finished, Ruth was quiet again, long enough that Amber checked her phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Ms. Collins," Ruth finally said. Her voice changed, sharper, more careful. I need you to not delete anything you found. Don't move it, don't forward it, don't screenshot it, and send it anywhere. Just leave it exactly where it is. Okay, Amber said. A cold feeling was spreading through her chest. Why? Because if what you are describing is what I think it might be, Ruth said, this is significantly above what either of us can handle without proper guidance. I'm going to make a call in the morning and I'll be in touch. She paused. Are you somewhere safe? The question landed strangely. I'm at home, Amber said. Okay. Stay there tonight. Ruth paused again. And Ms. Collins, you did the right thing calling. Amber set the phone down and looked around the room. The library that wasn't a library anymore. The empty shelves, the good rug Logan had found at an estate sale, and that she'd argued to keep because she genuinely loved it, and that she now found she couldn't stand the sight of. She didn't sleep well that night. 1,200 miles away, in a Sterling Aerospace conference room lit by the particular bluish light of a projector screen, Logan was looking at a timeline. Dwight, the cybersecurity analyst with the ink-stained hand, had built it overnight, a visual reconstruction of the breach, working backward from the transaction record to the hangar access to the corporate database queries. He'd put it on the wall screen and was explaining it in the systematic, unhurried way of a person who found clarity and precision. The monitoring device at the hangar was installed somewhere between November and December, 14 months ago, Dwight said, using a laser pointer with the practiced ease of someone who'd given a lot of presentations to people who needed them to be clear. Based on the model, it was transmitting to a receiver within a half-mile radius. We think whoever installed it was working from the adjacent airfield property. There's a maintenance building that was leased under a shell company during that same window. Logan watched the timeline and said nothing. The data accessed during that period included anything on a wireless network within the hangar, which means whatever you had connected there. External drives, tablets, anything with a signal. Dwight clicked to the next slide. We believe the primary target was files, not physical materials. Based on the documents Hartwell used in their filings, what they received was photographic or digital copies of early-stage development materials, not the notebooks themselves. Because the notebooks weren't connected to anything, Logan said. Correct. They're physical documents. They couldn't be accessed remotely. Attorney Carver, seated to Logan's left, leaned forward. Which is the fundamental gap in what Hartwell has. They have the premise of Elena Mercer's design. They don't have the mechanism. And the mechanism is in the notebooks, Logan said, which are now logged, photographed, and in our legal custody. Carver turned to the projector. The federal team is moving faster than I expected. The wire transfer is a clean trail. Brandon Keller made an error. He used his own LLC to receive the payment instead of a third-party cutout. Either he thought no one would look, or he thought the shell structure was sufficient. He thought no one would look, Logan said. He looked at me and saw a mechanic whose wife was leaving him. He thought the most dangerous thing I had was a lawyer who charged $150 an hour. No one in the room said anything to that. Olivia, standing near the wall, was watching Logan with an expression that wasn't pity. She wasn't built for pity. It didn't suit her face, but something close to the recognition of a specific kind of pain. There's something else, Dwight said. He clicked to a different slide. The database queries. The ones that accessed Sterling's internal personnel records, including files related to the original project team. Those were routed through the deactivated service account, which we traced to its original user, an IT contractor who left the company 3 years ago. He paused. The contractor was hired through a staffing agency that, when we ran it, connected to another LLC with overlapping registration addresses with ArcLight Consulting. The room processed this. He built the access 3 years ago, Olivia said. It wasn't disbelief. It was the flat sound of confirmation. He was planning this. The timing suggests the original corporate espionage plan may predate his personal involvement with Ms. Collins, Carver said carefully. The romantic relationship may have developed separately and then been leveraged, or may have been instrumental from the start. We don't know yet. Logan looked at the timeline on the wall. 3 years. The LLC registration dated to 8 months after Elena died, when Logan was barely functional, when Sophie was 4 years old and Logan was going through the specific hell of early grief while also figuring out how to keep a small person alive and healthy. Someone had been building a mechanism to steal Elena's work while Logan had been deciding between Cheerios and the fruit and grain option at the grocery store. I want to understand the full scope, Logan said. What exactly did he sell, and what does Hartwell actually have? Dwight pulled up a comparative analysis. The patent filings Hartwell had submitted overlapped with the first 4 stages of Elena's compression design: the problem statement, the initial approach, the first 2 iterations of the intake architecture. Significant, technically sophisticated, worth stealing. But it was, as Carver had said, the premise without the mechanism. The 3rd stage sequencing logic, the part that actually made the design work, the part that solved the pressure differential problem that had defeated every previous attempt at this class of turbine, was absent from Hartwell's filings entirely, because it was in notebooks 7 through 11. Notebooks that had never left the physical safe, Logan had built inside the tool bench in a hangar that was leased in his name and maintained with money from a mechanic's salary, and that had stayed locked for 3 years because Logan Mercer had, without ever fully knowing why, refused to let it go. What happens when the FBI moves? Logan asked Carver. Keller will be served with a warrant, likely within the week. Simultaneous action against Hartwell's principals, depending on what the investigators determine about their level of knowledge. She looked at him steadily. It will be loud. There will be coverage. I understand. Your name will be involved. I understand that too. Olivia, who had been quiet for a while, said, Logan, you should know, when this becomes public, the story isn't going to be about the engineering. The story people will pick up is the divorce, the timing, She paused. Optics of what happened in that courtroom and what was happening behind it. Logan looked at her. That's not my problem to manage. It will feel like your problem. Let it. He looked back at the timeline. The only thing I'm managing right now is whether this project gets built the way it was designed to be built. Everything else is noise. Carver made a note. Dwight shut down the projector. The meeting broke up in the way working meetings do when the decisions have been made and the next steps are clear. People gathering their things, the quiet resumption of motion, the transition from discussion to execution. Logan stayed in the conference room after the others left. He sat with the overhead lights slightly too bright and the projector screen gone dark and thought about 3 years. About the specific quality of the life he'd built during them. Small and honest and, in its own way, dignified. He didn't regret the garage. He didn't regret the Tacoma or the Fargo winters or the butterfly sticker on the parking lot light pole. Those years had been real. He was also sitting in a room that would have been his natural environment for the last 4 of them if he'd let it, and he'd walked away from it, and in the space he'd left, something ugly had taken root. He wasn't going to waste time being angry at himself for that. There was too much work. He got up, got coffee from the hallway machine, bad coffee, exactly as promised, and went to find Priya and Sophie. Sophie was in the simulator again. Or still. Priya had apparently decided that the way to handle a 7-year-old who crashed twice and called it good data was to keep giving her data. And so Sophie was currently attempting a controlled descent in a simulated Cessna, while Priya annotated something on a tablet and offered corrections in the careful voice of a person who had found an unexpected apprentice. Logan stood in the doorway and watched for a moment. Sophie's tongue was slightly out, a concentration tell she'd had since she was 2, and her hands were on the simulator controls with the focused seriousness of a person who was not playing but working. Pull up on the approach, Priya said. You're coming in too steep. I know. Don't fight it, correct it. Small adjustment. A pause, the simulator's engine sound shifting slightly. Then Sophie said, in a tone of pure satisfaction, There, Priya confirmed. See the difference? It's about not panicking, Sophie said. Panicking makes it worse. Priya glanced up and saw Logan in the doorway. Something in her expression was warm. She's a natural, she said, not quietly. Sophie whipped around. Dad, I landed it. Priya said I could try a crosswind landing next. Your homework first, Logan said. Sophie's face did the complicated calculation of a child who understood the rule was fair and was annoyed about it anyway. Fine, but I'm coming back. I'll be here, Priya said. Sophie unstrapped from the simulator and retrieved Rabbit from the shelf where she'd placed him to watch. Logan fell into step beside her as she led him down the corridor with the familiarity of someone who had already mapped this building. "Do you like it here?" he said, after a while. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to things that deserved it. "The building is weird, but the people are okay." She looked up at him. "Priya says Elena's design is the most interesting problem she's worked on." Logan kept his pace even. "Priya knew about Elena's work? She said everyone here does. She said it's like, how did she say it? Like the whole building is working on something someone started and couldn't finish." Sophie paused. "I thought that was kind of sad. Then I thought it was kind of cool." Logan looked at his daughter walking beside him, rabbit under her arm, backpack bouncing, matter of fact in the particular way of children who had grown up absorbing complex things in small doses and integrating them without drama. "Yeah," he said, "it's both." That evening, after Sophie was asleep and the campus had gone quiet, Logan sat at the table in the suite with Notebook 9 open in front of him and worked. He wasn't reading anymore. He was building. He had a legal pad, actual paper, which he still preferred for early-stage thinking. And he was translating Elena's third-stage sequencing logic into a working specification, the kind that could be handed to a fabrication team and built from. The notation was dense. Some of it he understood immediately. Some of it he had to sit with, trace the reasoning across pages, understand not just what Elena had calculated, but why she'd approached it the particular way she had. It was like a conversation, in a way. Across time, across the specific cruelty of what had happened, she was still in the problem with him, still making arguments, still double-backing on her own assumptions. He followed her reasoning and sometimes disagreed with it, and then realized 3 lines later that she'd anticipated his disagreement and addressed it. She'd been better at this than him. He'd always known that. He'd never found it threatening. He wrote for 3 hours. By midnight, he had a rough specification for the third-stage compression system. It wasn't complete. He'd need 2 more nights, probably, and input from Olivia's fabrication team on tolerances and material availability. But it was the skeleton, the essential shape of it. He sat back and looked at what he'd written. Tomorrow he would walk into the fabrication bay and start translating this into physical reality. That was the part he knew how to do, the part that lived in his hands as much as his head, the back and forth between the idea and the material that was the actual work of engineering. He was good at it. He'd always been good at it. His phone buzzed. It was a number he didn't recognize. Fargo area code. He answered it. "Mr. Mercer," a woman's voice, careful and professional. "My name is Agent Diane Holloway, FBI Economic Crimes. I'm sorry to call at this hour. I've been in contact with your attorney, Ms. Campos, and with Sterling Aerospace's legal team, so you may already know that we're moving forward with—" "I know," Logan said. "I need to inform you that we've located Brandon Keller. He's in Fargo. We'll be executing the warrant tomorrow morning." A brief pause. "I also want to let you know that we received a voluntary disclosure this afternoon from Amber Collins." Logan was quiet. "She brought us documentation from Keller's personal email," Agent Holloway continued. "Financial records. She came in voluntarily with no attorney present initially, which suggests she's operating on conscience rather than strategy." Another pause. "She also asked, and I want to pass this along, whether Sophie was all right." The suite was very quiet. Logan could hear the climate control system, the faint Nevada wind outside the window, Sophie's breathing from the next room, steady and even and entirely unaware. "Tell her Sophie is fine," he said. "I'll do that." A pause. "Mr. Mercer, I know this has been a difficult—" "What time tomorrow?" he said. Agent Holloway seemed to understand that he wasn't interested in having the difficult conversation acknowledged. 7 a.m. Fargo time. Simultaneously, we'll be executing warrants at 2 Hartwell executive offices in Dallas. Okay. We may need you available for a call tomorrow afternoon to clarify some technical aspects of the stolen materials. I'll be available. Thank you. And Mr. Mercer?" She paused again, and this time the pause felt genuine, unscripted. "For what it's worth. I've worked economic crimes for 11 years. What you protected in that hangar, the way you maintained it, all this time, that matters. It's the reason we have a case." Logan looked at the legal pad in front of him, the pages of his own handwriting translating someone else's thinking into the language of buildable things. "It wasn't about the case," he said. I know, Agent Holloway said. That's why I mentioned it. She hung up. Logan set the phone down and looked at the notebook still open on the table. Page 47 of Notebook 9. Elena's handwriting in the specific blue ink she used for what she called conviction calculations. The ones she was sure about. Outside, the Nevada mountains were dark shapes against a darker sky. And somewhere in Fargo, North Dakota, a federal warrant was being finalized with Brandon Keller's name on it. And somewhere across the city from that, Amber Collins was sitting in a house that still had someone else's good rug on the floor, waiting for a morning that was going to change the shape of everything she thought she knew. Logan closed Notebook 9. He picked up the legal pad, read what he'd written, crossed out 2 lines, and rewrote them cleaner. He was always cleaner the second time. He worked until 1 in the morning, until the specification was as complete as he could make it alone, and then he went to bed. He didn't lie awake. He was asleep in minutes, the sleep of someone who has done what they could with the day they had and has made peace with the limits of that. In the morning, over eggs that Sophie declared inferior to his normal eggs because the pan was the wrong weight, they sat at the kitchen table and talked about crosswind landings and what makes a good correction as opposed to a panicked overcorrection. And neither of them mentioned Fargo or federal warrants or the particular weight of 3 years that was somewhere in the process of being lifted. Then Sophie went to find Priya, and Logan went to the fabrication bay, and the work continued. The call from Ruth Campos came at 2 in the afternoon. He was arrested this morning, she said. I watched it on the local news. His attorney released a statement in the first hour, which means he either already knew this was coming or he moves fast. She paused. Amber went in voluntarily yesterday evening. She's cooperating, full disclosure. I heard, Logan said. How are you doing with that? With her cooperating, I mean. Logan was standing in the fabrication bay, phone pressed to his ear, the turbine assembly 10 feet away. One of the engineers, a young man named Cole, who had the look of someone who'd been skeptical of Logan's arrival and was revising that opinion, was waiting for him to come back to the conversation they'd been having about tolerance specifications. I'm fine with it, Logan said. It's the right thing. You're not... There's no part of you that wants to... Ruth. His voice was gentle. She came forward. That's what she could do. That's enough. A pause. Okay, Ruth said, in the tone of someone who had been braced for a different answer and was recalibrating. There's one more thing. The house, yours and Amber's, the settlement is technically finalized, but given that the divorce proceedings themselves were used as an instrument of the criminal scheme, the attorneys are looking at whether there's grounds to revisit the asset distribution. I don't want the house, Logan said. Logan, Sophie doesn't need to go back to a house with that history in it. Whatever's fair, work it out. I trust you. He looked at Cole, who was politely pretending to be very interested in a clipboard. I have to go. I'll call you tonight. He hung up and crossed back to Cole, who looked up with the expression of someone trying to determine the appropriate level of professional composure. Sorry, Logan said. Where were we? Cole pointed to a section of the assembly. 3rd stage housing. You said the tolerance on the inner ring needs to be tighter than the spec. By about 12 thousandths, Logan said. The original spec was written before Elena had finalized the sequencing logic. The compression in the 3rd stage generates more lateral force than the early models predicted. If we hold to the original tolerance, we'll see microfractures in the housing within the first 1,000 hours of operation. Cole looked at the assembly. He looked at Logan. He was 26, maybe 27, and he had the slightly stunned expression of a young engineer encountering someone who could read the implications of a design the way most people read plain text. How do you know the lateral force numbers? Cole said. Notebooks, Logan said. 7 and 8. I'll get you the relevant pages. Cole nodded slowly. Okay. He made a note on the clipboard. What else? Logan looked at the assembly. He put his hands in his pockets, which was what he did when he was thinking without wanting to touch something yet. Let's talk about the intake geometry, he said. Cole pulled up a schematic on his tablet and they got to work, and the conversation between them was specific and technical and periodically contentious in the way good engineering conversations are. Cole pushing back twice with questions that turned out to be valid, Logan revising his own conclusions once based on something Cole had noticed about the housing geometry that Logan had missed. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't fast, It was the kind of work that moved in inches and required you to be honest when you were wrong. It was the best Logan had felt in 3 years. The federal case moved faster than anyone expected, which was either a sign of how clean the evidence was or how badly someone at the Bureau wanted to close it before Hartwell's legal team could build a wall around their executives. Probably both. Logan found out about the Dallas arrests the same way most people found out about things they were centrally involved in but geographically removed from, through a news alert on his phone, standing in the Sterling fabrication bay with grease on his left hand and a torque specification in his right, while Cole watched from across the workbench with the expression of someone who had just registered that the man they'd been arguing with about housing tolerances for the past week was apparently a more complicated story than they'd understood. "You okay?" Cole said. Logan read the alert again. Federal authorities arrest 3 Hartwell defense executives on charges of corporate espionage and theft of proprietary technology. Simultaneous arrest of Fargo, North Dakota attorney Brandon Keller on related charges of wire fraud, forgery, and industrial espionage. "Yeah," Logan said. He put the phone in his pocket. "Where were we?" Cole stared at him for a moment. "You're serious?" "The intake geometry," Logan said. "You were saying the flange radius on the secondary diffuser was off." Cole looked at his clipboard, then back at Logan, then made an apparent decision to be professional about it. "Right. The flange radius." He found his place on the schematic. If you look at the measurement from the center line, it's reading 4 millimeters short on the left side, which, given what you told me about the lateral force distribution, it'll create an asymmetric pressure load on the intake, Logan finished. "Yeah, that's a fabrication error, not a design error. When was this section machined?" 8 months ago, before you got here." "We're going to have to recut it." Logan set down the torque spec and pulled the schematic closer, tracing the section with his finger. The measurement error was small enough that someone working from the original specification, which hadn't accounted for Elena's third-stage adjustments, would never have caught it. But small errors in turbine components had a way of becoming catastrophic ones. "Pull the CNC file and let me look at the original cut parameters. I want to understand how it happened before we correct it, or we'll make the same mistake twice." Cole nodded and moved to the computer terminal at the end of the bench. Logan looked at the flange, which sat in the assembly with the patient wrongness of a thing that had been built carefully to the wrong specification, and thought about the parallel between that and most of what had gone wrong in his life recently. Careful work. Wrong spec. Damage that accumulates quietly. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Olivia. "Board meeting moved to Friday. They want a progress report on the prototype. Can you give me something real by Thursday?" He typed back, "Yes. It won't be complete, but it'll be real." Her reply was immediate. "That's all I need." He put the phone away and bent back over the schematic. The thing about this kind of work, the detail work, the slow correction of accumulated errors, was that it required a specific kind of patience that had nothing to do with temperament and everything to do with understanding consequence. Logan had seen engineers lose that patience, get seduced by the larger vision, and start cutting corners on the small stuff, and he had watched those decisions come back around every time. Elena had been almost pathologically patient with the details. She used to say that an elegant solution had no wasted motion, and if you found yourself wanting to skip a step, the answer wasn't to skip it. The answer was to find a more elegant path to the same destination. He thought about that a lot in those days. Elegance. The most direct route between where you are and where you need to be that doesn't compromise the fundamental structure. It was good engineering advice. It was, if he was honest, pretty good life advice too. The news about the arrest spread through the Sterling campus by mid-morning. He could feel it the way you feel weather, a change in the atmosphere, people's body language slightly altered, conversations that stopped when he passed and resumed at a different register. Nobody said anything to him directly, which he appreciated. A few people nodded at him in the hallway with an acknowledgement that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite congratulations, but was something in between. The particular look of colleagues who understand that something significant has happened to someone they work alongside and are choosing to respect the privacy of it. Priya found him at lunch, which he'd taken at the workbench because he didn't want to stop. She set a sandwich beside his coffee without asking and sat on the stool across the bench. She was a small woman with the efficient movements of someone who had trained herself out of unnecessary gesture, and he'd noticed over the past week, thoughtful in a way that showed up not in what she said, but in what she paid attention to. "Sophie asked me something this morning," Priya said. Logan looked up. "She asked me if I thought her mom's design was going to work." Priya said it carefully, watching his face. "I want you to know I didn't bring up Elena." "She did." "What did you tell her?" "I told her yes. I told her the design was the most sophisticated approach to this class of turbine that I'd seen, and that I thought it was going to work." She paused. Was that the right thing to say? Logan looked at the sandwich she'd brought him, ham and mustard on rye, which was what he'd had yesterday, and she'd apparently noted. "Yeah," he said. "That was the right thing." Priya nodded. She didn't leave. "She also asked me if you were going to be okay." "She asked you that?" She said, and I'm quoting, "He gets this face sometimes when he's thinking about the project, and I can't tell if it's a working hard face or a sad face. Usually they look different, but lately they look the same." Priya said it gently. "She's perceptive." Logan looked at his hands on the schematic. The grease on his left palm had mostly dried. "I know she is." "I'm not asking you to do anything about it," Priya said. "I just thought you should know what she's noticing." She got up and went back to her work, and Logan sat with the sandwich and the schematic and the question his daughter had asked a woman she'd known for 1 week because she hadn't wanted to ask him and worry him. He ate the sandwich. He made a note to himself to be more careful about his face. That afternoon, he called Sophie from the fabrication bay doorway during a break, catching her between homework and a video call she was apparently having with her school friend in Fargo about something that required extensive negotiation. "Can you call back?" she said when she picked up. "Quick question. You doing okay?" A pause. He could hear the particular silence of a child deciding how honest to be. "I miss my room," she said finally. "I know. And I'm worried about Gerald." Gerald the fish had been shipped, as promised, via an arrangement Olivia had made that Logan chose not to examine too closely. Gerald had survived the journey and was currently in a small tank on the suite's windowsill, apparently no worse for the experience, but Sophie checked on him with a frequency that suggested ongoing concern. "He's eating okay, but he looks bored." "Fish don't get bored." "How do you know?" He didn't have a good answer for that. "Fair point." "Also," Sophie said, in the slightly lower voice she used when she was saying something she'd been working up to, "I saw the news thing on Priya's computer. She didn't know I could see it." Logan was quiet for a moment. "I know it's about Brandon," Sophie said, "and about what he did with Mom." "Sophie, I'm not upset about it." Her voice was careful, processing. I'm thinking about it." A pause. "Is Mom in trouble?" "She's cooperating with the investigation. She came forward herself." He kept his voice even. "She made some mistakes, Bug, but she's trying to fix what she can fix." Sophie was quiet. "Do you hate her?" "No." "Do you hate Brandon?" He thought about Brandon Keller in that courtroom, leaning down to say something in Amber's ear. Brandon Keller, who had looked at a hangar full of someone's grief and seen an asset to be liquidated. "I think what he did was wrong," Logan said. "I think he understood what he was doing, and he did it anyway. That's its own kind of answer." "That's not really an answer to whether you hate him." "No," Logan said. "It's not. But it's what I've got right now." Sophie seemed to accept this. He heard her shift on whatever surface she was sitting on. "Priya thinks the turbine is going to be done in like 3 months. 3 months is optimistic. She says you work fast when you're motivated. She's been watching me for a week. She said she could tell." A pause. "Dad, the working hard face and the sad face, I know they look different. I'm not confused about which one is which. I just think you're allowed to have both at the same time." Logan stood in the doorway of the fabrication bay with the Nevada afternoon warm at his back and the cool industrial air of the building on his face, and felt the specific weight of having a child who understood you more clearly than you wanted to be understood and loved you anyway. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said, and went back to her negotiation with Fargo. The board meeting on Friday was in a room that communicated money without being ostentatious about it. A long table, serious chairs, a view of the mountains through glass that was definitely not standard grade. 9 board members, 7 of them present in person, and 2 appearing on screens at opposite ends of the room. Logan had been in rooms like this before and found them neither intimidating nor particularly comfortable, just a specific environment with its own rules. He gave his presentation without slides. He'd considered slides and decided against them because the essential information was better said plainly than visualized, and because he didn't trust himself not to over-engineer a slide deck the way he over-engineered everything. He stood at the end of the table and told them what he'd found, what he'd fixed, and what remained. He told them the truth about the timeline, that Priya's 3 months was probably 4 to 5, that there would be setbacks he couldn't predict, that the third-stage compression system was solvable but not simple. He told them the fabrication error he'd found in the secondary diffuser housing and what it had cost them in time and what correcting it would require. He told them that Elena's design was fundamentally sound, that the notebook documentation was now fully integrated into the legal and engineering record, and that the Hartwell filings would not survive a challenge once the full record was presented. He spoke for 22 minutes and then stopped. One of the board members, an older man named Prescott, who had the look of someone who had been doubtful about Logan's involvement from the start and was doing arithmetic in his head, leaned forward. "You're telling us 5 months minimum." "I'm telling you 4 to 5, yes." "That's beyond the timeline Olivia presented to us in March." The timeline Olivia presented in March was built on the assumption that the existing fabrication work was correct. The secondary diffuser error alone set us back 6 weeks. I can't control errors that happened before I got here. Prescott looked at him steadily. "What's your confidence level on the third stage sequencing?" "That's the piece we've never had demonstrated." "High," Logan said. "That's not a number." "It's not a number because engineering confidence isn't a number, Mr. Prescott. It's a judgment call based on experience with the design, the materials, and the documentation. I've spent 30 hours with Elena Mercer's notebooks, and I understand the sequencing logic well enough to implement it. My confidence is high." "You built this design originally." "I was part of the team that developed it. Elena led it." He didn't hedge on this, didn't soften it. "The core innovation is hers. What I bring is the knowledge of how she thought, which is the piece that the last 3 engineers didn't have." Another board member, a woman named Tran, who had been making notes throughout, looked up. "What's the risk profile if we hold to this timeline and something goes wrong in fabrication?" "We lose time. We don't lose the design. The design is protected now, legally and physically. The risk isn't the design anymore." Logan looked around the table. "The risk is execution, which is manageable because I know what I'm building and I know how to build it." Prescott looked at Olivia, who had been sitting at the opposite end of the table in the posture of someone who had faith in what they'd set in motion and was letting it run. "You're comfortable with this?" Prescott said to her. "I've been comfortable with Logan Mercer since I understood what he'd maintained in that hangar for 3 years with no institutional support and no guarantee anyone would ever ask for it," Olivia said. "Yes, I'm comfortable." Prescott looked back at Logan. 4 to 5 months, he said. 4 to 5 months, Logan confirmed. Prescott sat back. Around the table, something shifted. Not unanimity, because boards don't work that way, and there were faces that still held reservations. But the weight of the room changed. The meeting moved forward. Afterward, in the hallway outside the boardroom, Olivia caught up with him. "Prescott was harder on you than I expected," she said. "He was doing his job," Logan said. "He's supposed to be hard." "You didn't flinch." "I wasn't wrong about anything I said. It's easier not to flinch when you're not wrong." She looked at him sideways. "Is it ever that simple for you?" "Not usually. Today was an exception." He stopped at the elevator. "How much of the board is still skeptical?" 3 of them, Prescott included. She pressed the call button. "They'll come around when they see the prototype running." "They'll come around when they see the prototype running correctly," Logan said. "Which isn't the same thing as running." The elevator opened. They got in. "The legal team wants to debrief you on the Keller situation Monday," Olivia said, "specifically around the documentation chain. The FBI is building their technical case, and they want your testimony about the notebook's provenance." "Fine. It means you'll have to go on record about Elena, the development process, the timeline, the relationship between her work and the stolen materials." The elevator moved. Logan watched the floor numbers change. "I know," he said. "Is that—" She paused, choosing the word manageable? "It's necessary," he said. "Which makes it manageable." She looked at him. He could feel her looking at him the way he could sometimes feel Cole looking at him across the workbench. That specific quality of attention people gave you when they were trying to understand something about how you worked. "You do that a lot," she said. "Do what?" "Convert something from hard to necessary. Like once something's necessary, the difficulty stops being relevant." He thought about that. "It doesn't stop being relevant," he said. "It just stops being the point." The elevator opened on the engineering level. She went right and he went left, back toward the fabrication bay and Cole and the secondary diffuser housing that needed to be recut. The weekend arrived in the particular way weekends arrived when you were in the middle of a project and had a 7-year-old, not as rest exactly, but as a different kind of activity. Sophie had compiled a list of things she wanted to do in Reno that was longer and more organized than most adults' vacation itineraries. And Logan worked through it with her on Saturday with the same methodical approach he brought to the fabrication bay. They went to a natural history museum in the morning. Sophie spent 40 minutes in the geology section reading plaques with the focused attention of a person cross-referencing information she already had, and Logan watched her and drank bad museum coffee and felt the particular piece of a day that asked nothing of him except presence. In the afternoon, they found a park near the river. Sophie ran ahead on the path while Logan followed at the comfortable distance she'd established was correct. Close enough to be reachable, far enough to be his own person, and he watched her navigate the world with the slightly tilted forward way she moved, always half a step ahead of wherever she officially was, always looking at the next thing. He thought about Fargo, about the house he didn't want back, about the butterfly sticker on the parking lot light pole that would be there next time he went back and that he would check on when he did. Not because it mattered in any practical sense, but because it was Sophie's, and Sophie's things mattered. He thought about Amber sitting in a federal building voluntarily, answering questions that were going to be uncomfortable to answer. He felt something about that he didn't fully have words for. Not forgiveness, exactly, because forgiveness was too organized a thing for where he was with it. More like acknowledgement, that she had done something right at some cost to herself. That people did wrong things and then sometimes, given the chance, did right ones. That this didn't cancel out, but it didn't disappear either. He thought about Elena because he was always thinking about Elena in some part of his brain, the way you think about the grammar of a language you were raised in. Not always consciously, but always present in the structure of how you process things. He thought about her in the notebooks, in the margins, in the Ask Elle about friction coefficient notes, that were maybe the most intimate thing he'd read in 3 years because they were her thinking out loud to him from a place she couldn't come back from. Sophie stopped on the path ahead and turned around, waiting for him to catch up. "You have the face," she said when he reached her. "Which one?" She studied him. "Both," she said. "Same time." Then she took his hand and kept walking, and he walked beside her. The week that followed was the most productive Logan had been since the period before Elena got sick. The sustained, almost physical pleasure of a problem that was hard enough to require everything you had and tractable enough to yield to it. He and Cole fell into a working rhythm that surprised them both. A back and forth that was occasionally heated and usually productive, where Cole pushed on the numbers and Logan pushed on the design intent, and somewhere in the middle they found the most honest version of both. Priya joined them on Wednesday with data from a computational fluid dynamics model she'd been running on the third-stage compression sequence. She spread her printouts on the workbench with the contained excitement of someone who has found what they were looking for but is maintaining professional composure about it. "The sequencing logic works," she said. "The simulation ran clean, no turbulence cascade in the third stage under any of the pressure conditions we modeled." Cole looked at the data. "That can't be right. The pressure differential at point 3 should cause—" "It should," Priya said, "unless the sequencing precisely counterbalances the differential." "Which it does." She pointed to a section of the data. "The timing of the compression pulses cancels the turbulence before it develops. It's not suppression. It's prevention." She looked up at Logan. "Elena designed the solution into the sequencing itself. The turbine doesn't fight the turbulence. It doesn't give it a chance to form." The fabrication bay was quiet for a moment. Cole looked at Logan. "How did she figure that out?" Logan looked at the simulation data. He thought about Notebook 8, page 62, where Elena had written in the margin, in her blue conviction ink, not suppression, prevention. "Find the moment before the problem exists. He'd read it at 1 in the morning in the suite and had to stop and just sit with it for a while. She was honest about the physics, Logan said. She didn't try to solve the problem she had. She went back far enough to find the problem before it became a problem. Cole looked at the data for a long time. Then he said quietly, "That's a good way to do things." "Yeah," Logan said. She was good at it. The Keller case moved through the federal system with the inexorable momentum of evidence that is overwhelming and well organized. Logan gave his testimony to the FBI's technical consultants on Monday, 3 hours in a conference room with Agent Holloway and 2 technical analysts who asked good questions and wrote down his answers with the careful respect of people who understood they were documenting something precise. He told them about Elena's development process. He explained the notebook system, the color coding, the shorthand, the sequencing of ideas across the 14 volumes. He explained why the stolen early-stage materials were valuable but incomplete, like having the first 2 acts of something without the third, the resolution that made sense of everything that came before. He was specific and unhurried. And when Agent Holloway asked whether he thought Brandon Keller had understood the full value of what he'd stolen, Logan was quiet for a moment before he answered. "He understood it was worth money," Logan said. "I don't think he understood what it was. There's a difference." Holloway looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean that to someone who doesn't understand the engineering, those notebooks are a document with a dollar value attached to it. To someone who does," he paused, "it's years of someone's thinking. It's the inside of how a person's mind worked. You can put a price on the document. You can't put a price on the thinking." He looked at his hands. He sold something he didn't understand. That's the part that bothers me, maybe more than the theft. Holloway wrote something down. "For the record," she said, "Keller has entered a plea negotiation. He's providing information about Hartwell's principles in exchange for reduced charges. The Hartwell executives are not cooperating, which typically means their attorneys think they can fight it, which typically means they can't. It just takes longer." She looked up. "The technical evidence is clean. Your testimony confirms the provenance and value of the stolen materials. The case is strong." "And Amber?" Logan said. "Full cooperation, consistent testimony, voluntary disclosure. The prosecutors are recommending she be treated as a witness rather than a defendant. Her attorney, she has one now, not from Keller's firm, says she's doing as well as can be expected." Holloway paused. She asked again through counsel about Sophie, whether Sophie's been affected. "Sophie is fine," Logan said. "She's learning to fly a simulator." Something moved in Holloway's face, not quite a smile, but in the vicinity of one. "I'll pass that along." He walked out of that conference room into the Nevada afternoon and stood for a moment in the parking lot, in the particular flatness that follows something you've been bracing for and that turned out to be manageable. The sky was the high, clear blue that Nevada did in November, the mountains sharp-edged against it. He texted Olivia, "Technical testimony done. Case is strong." She replied, "Dinner tonight. Not about work. Sophie can come. There's a place near the river that has good fish tacos and won't make us talk about compression ratios." He looked at the message for a moment. Then he typed, "She'll want to tell you about the simulator." "I want to hear about the simulator," Olivia wrote back. He put the phone in his pocket and walked back into the building. Cole was at the workbench with the recut diffuser housing, checking the measurements against spec, with the slightly tense focus of someone who has been shown an error they didn't catch and is determined to catch every subsequent one. "How's it looking?" Logan said. Cole straightened up. 12 thousandths off was right. "The recut is clean. We're within tolerance." "Good." Logan came to the bench and looked at the housing. "Let's fit it." Cole handed him the housing and he turned it in his hands, checking the surface and the edge geometry by feel the way mechanics develop and engineers sometimes forget. It was right. He could feel it. He set it on the bench and picked up the fitting tool. "You know," Cole said as they worked, "before you got here, I had this design in my head as something that might be possible. Like theoretically sound, but practically maybe not achievable." He paused, holding a component steady while Logan aligned the housing. "Now it feels inevitable. Like it was always going to work. We just had to catch up to it." Logan fitted the housing into place and checked the alignment. Clean. "That's what good design does," he said. "It waits for you." Cole looked at the assembly. "Whose line is that, yours or hers?" Logan thought about it. "Honestly, he said. I'm not sure anymore. He reached for the torque wrench, and the work continued, and the turbine that Elena had imagined in a notebook in blue ink took another small step toward becoming real. That evening, at a table near the river with fish tacos that were genuinely good and a view of the water going silver in the early dark, Sophie told Olivia about the crosswind landing in the kind of detail that required arm gestures and sound effects. Olivia listened with her full attention, asking questions at the right moments, and Logan watched the two of them across the table and felt something he recognized as the specific grace of ordinary things. A meal, a child talking, water moving past in the dark, landing in the right place at the right time. It wasn't fixed. Nothing was fully fixed. There were still months of work ahead, and a legal case working its way through federal channels, and a daughter who had packed Rabbit in a bag and gotten on a plane and was doing better than she had any obligation to do. There was still the fact of what had been lost and what it had cost, and the 3 years that couldn't be returned. But the turbine was going to work. He was certain of it now in the specific way you become certain about structural things. Not with hope, but with knowledge. The design was sound. The documentation was intact. The work was real. Elena's work was going to be finished. He picked up his taco and listened to Sophie explain the physics of crosswind correction to a billionaire CEO who was taking notes on a napkin, and the river kept moving past them in the dark. And the evening held. The prototype ran for the first time on a Tuesday in late March, 4.5 months after Logan had walked into the Sterling fabrication bay with grease on his hand and a torque specification he'd been interrupted reading. It was not a dramatic moment, in the way that people who haven't done this kind of work imagine dramatic moments to be. There was no countdown. Nobody popped anything. The fabrication bay smelled the same as it always did. Machined metal, industrial cleaning product, the particular staleness of recycled air, and the team that had built the thing stood around it with the specific tension of people who have done everything they could do and are now waiting to find out if everything was enough. Cole was at the monitoring station, which was a laptop, and 2 external displays arranged on a folding table 20 feet from the assembly. His leg was bouncing. He'd been doing that for an hour and didn't seem to know it. Priya stood to Logan's left, arms crossed, tablet under one arm, her face doing the controlled thing it did when she was managing an emotion she hadn't decided whether to express yet. Logan stood directly in front of the turbine. He'd been standing there for about 3 minutes, not doing anything in particular, just looking at it the way you look at something you've been building for a long time when you're about to find out what it actually is. It was a physical object now. Metal and tolerance and the specific reality of things that exist in 3 dimensions rather than on paper. It was also, in a way he couldn't fully separate from the engineering, Elena's thinking made material. 14 notebooks, 4.5 months, 1 recut diffuser housing, and more late nights than he'd counted. All of it had led to this machine standing in this room under fluorescent lights, looking somewhat less heroic than the concept had been in the notebook sketches. Most things did. That was the truth about building. The idea is always more elegant than the object. The object has weight and surface imperfection, and the marks of the hands that made it. Logan had always thought that was fine. Better, even. A thing that exists imperfectly is more honest than an idea that exists perfectly. "Whenever you're ready," he said to Cole. Cole's legs stopped bouncing. He put his hands on the keyboard. "Startup sequence," he said, and initiated it. The turbine spun up. It did it the way a well-built machine does. Not dramatically, not with the violent initial struggle that poorly designed systems exhibit, but with a progressive build that you felt in your chest before you heard it clearly. A low harmonic that climbed in frequency and settled into something continuous and even. Logan watched the monitoring displays over Cole's shoulder. Pressure readings, temperature, RPM, the dozen other parameters they'd been watching for months in simulation and were now watching in physical reality. 3rd stage compression engaged at the 40-second mark. Logan had run this moment in his head so many times, the sequencing logic activating, the compression pulses firing in the timing Elena had designed, the pressure differential that had defeated every previous approach to this turbine class either being managed or not being managed, either validating 4.5 months and 3 years and a woman's last productive year of work or not. The data on Cole's screens didn't spike. It didn't cascade. It held its line with the steady, almost boring reliability of a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Cole leaned toward the screen. Then he leaned back. "Pressure nominal," he said. His voice was strange, compressed, like he was keeping it carefully inside normal parameters the way the turbine was keeping its pressure inside normal parameters. "Temperature nominal. Third stage compression is... It's clean. It's completely clean." Priya put her hand over her mouth. Then she lowered it. "Runtime," she said. 4 minutes, 20 seconds. "Keep it running." They ran it for 11 minutes on the first test. Every parameter held. The third stage sequencing performed exactly as Elena's notebooks had described it. Not suppression of the turbulence cascade, but prevention. The timing so precise that the problem never got the chance to exist. Logan watched the data and thought about page 62 of Notebook 8 and felt something that had no clean name, relief and grief, and the particular satisfaction of something finished correctly and the specific ache of the person who should have been there to see it not being there. When Cole shut down the sequence, the fabrication bay was very quiet for a moment. Then Cole said, "It works," in a voice that had completely given up on being professional about it. Priya made a sound that was not quite a word. Logan put his hand on the turbine housing. The metal was warm from the run. He held it there for a moment, palm flat against the surface, and didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Elena would have understood the gesture. She always had. They ran 3 more tests that day. 2 the following morning. All 5 were clean, each successive run building the data record that the engineers needed and that the legal team needed and that the board needed and that Logan needed. Not because he doubted it, but because certainty required evidence, and evidence required repetition. And he was not a man who stopped before the work was actually done. On the 3rd day after the first successful test, Olivia called a meeting that included the engineering team, the legal team, and the full board via video conference. She presented the test data with the same economy she brought to everything, let the numbers speak, and did not editorialize. The board, including Prescott, asked their questions. The questions were good. The answers were better. At the end, Prescott leaned back in his chair and looked down the conference table at Logan. "I was skeptical," he said. "I know," Logan said. "I want to go on record as having been skeptical," Prescott said, "because it makes the next part matter more. The design is everything Olivia said it was. You delivered what you said you'd deliver." He paused, and something in his face shifted from the board member expression into something more personal. "And the way you protected Elena Mercer's work, all those years, that deserves to be said out loud." Logan looked at the older man for a moment. "Thank you," he said, and meant it, and left it there. The board voted to move to full production development. Unanimous. Brandon Keller was sentenced 8 weeks after his arrest. The federal case had moved with the speed that happens when a defendant provides cooperation, and the evidence is clean, and the other side's attorneys are busy negotiating their own client's exposure rather than building a robust defense. He received 4 years in federal prison on the wire fraud and industrial espionage charges, with additional civil liability pending Sterling Aerospace's lawsuit for damages. Logan found out from Ruth Campos, who called on a Thursday afternoon while he was eating lunch at the fabrication bay workbench, which had become a habit so established that Cole had started leaving a stool clear for him. 4 years, Ruth said. With good behavior, probably less. Okay, Logan said. There's more. The asset distribution from your divorce. The attorneys have been working with the federal civil side. Because the proceedings were used instrumentally in the criminal scheme, there's a case for revisiting the settlement, specifically the liquid assets, the savings, the investment accounts. The house Amber is keeping, that's different. But the money that was direct product of the scheme, Ruth, Logan set down the sandwich. I told you, I don't want to fight over the money. It's not fighting. It's a legal determination that's moving forward regardless of whether you push it, because the federal case established the facts. She paused. The number is about 60,000. After legal fees, it'll be processed through the court and returned to you. Put it in Sophie's education account. Silence on the line. Logan, all of it. I don't need it, and she will. Set it up properly. He heard Ruth writing something. Okay, she said, with the tone of someone who has represented a person for long enough to stop arguing when they've made a decision. Okay, I'll handle it. How's Amber doing? he said.
Another pause, different in quality. She's navigating it. Her testimony was hard. She didn't know the full scope of what Brandon was doing, but she knew enough to have made different choices. She's dealing with that. Ruth's voice was careful. She asked me to tell you that she's sorry. Not through an official channel, not as part of any legal thing, just to tell you. Logan was quiet for a moment. Cole was at the other end of the workbench, very politely not listening.
Tell her I heard that, Logan said. And tell her Sophie is doing well. She can know that. He put the phone down and looked at his sandwich and thought about Amber in that house with the good rug, navigating the wreckage of choices she'd made and choices that had been made around her, trying to find a version of herself that could live with both. He didn't know if she'd find it. He hoped she would, the way you hope for people you no longer have the standing to wish well in any direct way, from a distance, without expectation, because they're human and humans deserve the possibility of their better versions. He picked up the sandwich and went back to the schematic he'd been reviewing before Ruth called. The Hartwell executives took longer. Their attorneys were expensive and thorough, and the case against the principals was more complex than the case against Keller, who had been the operational instrument of the scheme rather than its architects. Logan followed the case in the news with moderate attention, enough to understand the shape of it, not so much that it occupied space he needed for other things. 3 of the 4 executives eventually reached plea agreements. The 4th went to trial and lost badly, which is what happens when the opposing counsel has complete notebook documentation and a technical expert who can explain it clearly, and an FBI agent who spent 11 years building economic crimes cases and knows exactly how to present evidence to a jury that doesn't have engineering backgrounds. Logan testified at that trial via video conference. 2.5 hours, morning session, from a conference room at Sterling with Cole and Priya watching through the glass wall like he was performing surgery. He explained Elena's development process, the notebook documentation system, the specific innovations that Hartwell had attempted to appropriate, and why those innovations were original, distinct, and attributable to a specific person at a specific time. The opposing attorney tried 3 different approaches to create doubt about the notebook provenance. Logan answered each one honestly and specifically and without heat, the way he answered questions about engineering, not trying to win the argument, just trying to say what was true. The jury convicted on 7 counts. When the verdict came in, Logan was in the fabrication bay with a cup of cold coffee and a design specification for the next phase of production development, and Cole found him there and said, "You see the news?" And Logan said, "Yeah." And Cole said, "How do you feel?" And Logan thought about it for a moment and said, "Done," which was the most accurate word he had. Done was not the same as healed. Done was not the same as over, in the internal sense where things are actually over rather than just concluded. But it was something. A chapter end, real this time, not theoretical. He drank the cold coffee and went back to the specification. The engineering center happened because of something Sophie said. They'd been back to Fargo twice during the months of development. Once for a school visit because Sophie's teacher had been understanding, but Sophie's academic record required some attention, and once for a weekend that Logan used to check on Janice and the garage and to walk through the town that had been his life for 3 years without the weight of the legal case hanging over it. He stood in the garage and ran his hand along the tool chest and felt what he'd felt in the hangar before he left. Not sentiment exactly, more like acknowledgement. This place was real. The years he'd spent here were real. They'd led somewhere, and that somewhere was also real. Janice had kept the garage exactly as Logan had left it, including the parts inventory system that only Logan fully understood, which Janice had been navigating by a combination of logical inference and what he called professional intuition, which appeared to be working. "You come back?" Janice said. Not accusatory, not hopeful, just asking. "Eventually," Logan said. "Not full time, but I need a base here. Sophie needs to come back to Fargo." Janice nodded. "Then the garage waits." The conversation that led to the engineering center happened on the second Fargo trip, on a Sunday afternoon. Sophie was at the kitchen table of the apartment they were renting, doing homework, and Logan was on a call with Olivia about the production development timeline. And Sophie said, not looking up from her homework, "Are we actually going back to Nevada after this?" He covered the phone. "For a while. The production phase needs—" "I know it needs," Sophie said. I'm asking if we're going back after. He looked at her. She was 8 now, since January. Same birthday as Elena, which was something he lived with quietly. She had the homework spread out in her particular organizational system, which was elaborate and made complete sense only to her. Where do you want to be? He said. She looked up. Here, she said. I want to come back here for school, my real school, with Marcus and everybody. She paused. But I also want to keep helping Priya with the data modeling on weekends. Those two things are in different states. I know, Sophie said, with the patience of a child who has already thought through the problem and is waiting for the adult to catch up. That's why you need to figure it out. He went back to his call with Olivia and told her what Sophie had said, mostly because he was starting to tell Olivia things because she was good to think out loud with, and she was quiet for a moment and then said, "What if we didn't make her choose?" The engineering center took the better part of a year to plan and 6 months to build, which was fast for the scale of it. Logan and Olivia spent a considerable amount of time arguing about what it should be, not bitterly, but specifically, the way they argued about engineering problems, pushing on each other's reasoning until the thing was honest. Olivia's first instinct was a research satellite, a small outpost of Sterling's Nevada campus, efficient and contained. Logan's first instinct was something different. It can't just be Sterling, he said. If it's a corporate facility in Fargo, it's a corporate facility in Fargo. It hires Sterling engineers, it does Sterling research, and in 10 years it's gone, or it's a tax consideration. Then what? A center. Actually, community embedded. Engineering and technical education programs, partnerships with the school districts, daycare and support services for working families. He looked at the site plans they'd spread on the conference table. There are a lot of people in North Dakota who are good at building things. There always have been. There's just never been a place that said that mattered. Olivia looked at the plans. That's a different scope. I know. It's also much more expensive. I know that too. She looked at him. Is this about Sophie, or is this about the town? Both, he said. Those aren't different things. She picked up the site plan and turned it in her hands. Looking at it the way she looked at data, she was deciding whether to trust. The Sterling Foundation has a community development mandate, she said finally. If we structure it right, we can pull funding from that in addition to the capital budget. She set the plan down. Tell me what you're actually imagining. He told her. It took an hour and a half and 2 rounds of coffee, and at some point they stopped talking about funding structures and started talking about what it should feel like to walk into that building, which was how Logan always knew a project had become real. When the conversation stopped being about mechanism and started being about the experience of the thing. The Mercer Sterling Engineering Center. The name was Olivia's suggestion, which she made simply and which Logan received simply, and neither of them made a thing of it. Opened on a Thursday in November when the North Dakota sky was doing its November thing, and the parking lot held more cars than anyone had projected, and somebody had failed to adequately heat the coffee station in the main atrium, which was a problem that got fixed in the first 45 minutes. 312 people came to the opening. School district representatives, local contractors. A Congressman Logan didn't know who had been briefed on the project and showed up with a prepared statement that was fine but ran 4 minutes too long. Engineers from Sterling's Nevada campus who had flown in, including Cole and Priya, who stood near the turbine display. A cross-section of the production prototype mounted on a wall panel, because Logan had argued that the center should have something real in it rather than just models. And Priya kept putting her hand on the display casing the way Logan had put his hand on the prototype housing the first time it ran, which he noticed and appreciated. Janice was there, standing near the back in a suit that fit him about as well as Logan's courtroom jacket had fit Logan, which was to say not well, but with a dignity that transcended the fit. He'd brought his wife, a quiet woman named Inga, whom Logan had met twice, and she looked at everything with the careful attention of someone cataloging the world for future reference. Amber came. Logan had not expected that. He'd sent an invitation through Ruth, mostly because Sophie had asked him to, not in a dramatic way, just practically, the way Sophie did things, saying, "She's still my mom. She should be able to come if she wants." And so he'd sent it, and he'd thought she probably wouldn't, and then she was there in the 3rd row during the opening remarks, sitting alone, in a gray coat he didn't recognize, looking straight ahead. He saw her when he was walking toward the podium. Their eyes met for about 3 seconds. He nodded. She nodded. She looked like someone who was holding themselves together with sustained effort and doing it well enough. She looked like herself, minus the certainty she used to carry like armor. He didn't know if that was progress or damage. Maybe both. Maybe the same thing. He went to the podium. He had not prepared remarks, which was a decision that had made Olivia mildly nervous. He stood in front of 312 people in a building he'd spent a year fighting for and looked out at them and thought about what was actually true. My wife Elena designed a turbine, Asam, he said. She spent the last year of her life doing it. She was meticulous and she was brilliant, and she wrote everything down in notebooks she kept in her own system. And she was also human, which means she doubted herself more often than the work deserved. And she kept revision notes that were funnier than most people's finished writing, and she had a way of eating crackers while she calculated that drove me insane. He paused. She didn't get to finish what she started. That's the shape of some lives. You build something important and you don't get to see it run. The atrium was quiet. Outside, snow was beginning to come down. The first real snow of the season, the kind that committed. I spent 3 years being angry at that shape, Logan said. Not loudly. I didn't have the energy for loud. But I was angry. And I protected what she'd built. And I raised our daughter. And I worked on cars. And I told myself that was enough. He looked at the cross-section of the turbine on the wall. Then someone tried to steal what she'd made, and it turned out the only way to protect it was to finish it, which was, in a way, the thing I'd been avoiding. He looked back at the room. I don't have a lesson for you about that. I'm just telling you what happened to me. Sometimes you finish the thing because you want to. Sometimes you finish it because the world makes it necessary. Either way, you finish it. He looked at Sophie, who was in the front row between Priya and Janice, Rabbit in her lap. Because she still brought Rabbit to important events, and Logan had decided that this was simply true and required no comment. And who was watching him with the expression she'd had since she was 4 years old, when he talked about something that mattered, which was serious and warm at the same time, like she was filing it. The center is named for Elena, he said. Not because I wanted my name on a building, I didn't, particularly, but because this is the kind of place she would have wanted to exist. A place where people who are good at building things can build them, where the work is taken seriously, where someone's 7-year-old can learn to fly a simulator, a small sound of recognition from the front row, and where that's considered a legitimate use of the space. He paused. We built a lot of things in here. Engineering labs, classrooms, a daycare center, a simulator that is already being argued over. We also installed a coffee station that turns out to be undersupplied. We're working on it. Laughter, easy and real, moved through the room. That's all I've got, he said. Go look at the turbine. Olivia was waiting when he came down from the podium. She handed him a cup of coffee, which was from a thermos she'd apparently brought from somewhere and not from the undersupplied station. That was good, she said. It was honest, he said. Those aren't different things. He looked at her. She was looking back at him with the directness she always had. The quality of her attention that he had learned over months of working alongside her was not assessment but genuine presence, the act of actually seeing someone rather than processing them. Thank you for this, he said. He meant the center, the project, the year. He also meant the parking lot outside a courthouse in Fargo, when he'd had nothing except a daughter and a weatherproof case and the particular stubbornness of a person who keeps the things that matter even when there's no clear reason to. Thank you for coming back, she said. And she meant the project too. She also meant more than the project, and they both knew it, and they left it there. In that space of known things that hadn't been spoken yet and didn't need to be today. Sophie appeared at Logan's elbow. Amber's here, she said. Not anxiously, just factually. I know, Logan said. Are you okay with that? Sophie considered. I'm going to go talk to her, she said. Is that okay with you? Logan looked at his daughter, 8 years old, Rabbit under her arm, asking him for permission to do a kind thing. Yeah, he said. That's okay with me. He watched Sophie cross the atrium. He watched her reach Amber, who looked up from her gray coat with an expression that was, he couldn't fully see it from this distance, but he could read the posture, surprised, and then something that broke slightly at the edges, the particular breaking of someone who has been braced for less than they got. Sophie sat down next to her mother. She put Rabbit on the seat between them, which was Sophie's way of sharing something important without making it dramatic. Amber looked at the rabbit and then at Sophie, and whatever Sophie said next made Amber put her hand over her eyes for a moment, and then take it away, and nod. Olivia, who had followed his gaze, said quietly, "She's something, your kid." "Yeah," Logan said, "she really is." He thought about Elena, because he always did in moments when Sophie was most herself. He thought about what Elena would have made of this room, the building she'd never see, the turbine on the wall, the daughter they'd made together who was sitting next to the woman who had come after her and handing that woman a stuffed rabbit because that was Sophie's language for "I'm not keeping score and you don't have to earn this." He thought Elena would have found the engineering center ambitious in the specific way she liked things to be ambitious. Not grandiose, just honest about how large the actual problem was. He thought she would have been harder on the structural choices than Logan had been. He thought she would have been right. He thought she would have approved of Olivia, who was precise and didn't flinch and had flown to a courthouse parking lot because she was out of time and she believed in the work. Elena had always respected people who showed up. He didn't talk to Amber that day. That wasn't the right time, and he didn't know if there was a right time, and he was comfortable with not knowing. Some things didn't need to be resolved into clean categories. Some people you had history with and harm with and a child with, and that was just the shape of it, present tense, requiring ongoing navigation rather than a verdict. He'd stopped needing verdicts about most things. What he had instead was a turbine that ran clean, and a daughter who brought her rabbit to important events, and a building full of people looking at things that were built with care, and a woman who had come to a courthouse parking lot without knowing if he'd come outside or what he'd say if he did, and had waited anyway. Late in the afternoon, when most of the official program was over, and the atrium had settled into the looser, louder quality of a gathering that had relaxed into itself, Logan walked through the building alone, not performing an inspection, just looking at what had been made. The engineering labs had the specific quality of rooms that were waiting for the work that was about to happen in them. Clean benches, organized tools, the potential energy of prepared space. The classrooms were smaller than he'd wanted and larger than the budget had initially allowed for, because he and Olivia had argued about square footage the way they argued about tolerances, and had found the right number by pushing on each other's reasoning. The daycare center smelled of fresh paint and the particular warmth of a space designed for small people, and the woman who ran it, a former teacher named Val, who had the competence and lack of sentimentality that the job required, was already talking to two parents about enrollment. He stopped in the hallway outside the simulator lab. Through the window, he could see Priya inside with 3 kids, Sophie, and 2 others from the school district program, explaining the control panel with the animated precision she brought to things she loved. Sophie was in the simulator seat, head turned to listen, and whatever Priya was saying had the quality of something that was going to be remembered. Logan stood in that hallway for a while. He was 33 years old. He had a daughter who was going to be a better engineer than him if she wanted to be, and who might not want to be, and either way was going to be fine. He had work that mattered in the specific, concrete way that work matters when it's solving a real problem rather than a theoretical one. He had a legal case behind him, and a production development project ahead of him, and a building full of people who were going to use it for things he couldn't predict, which was the best thing you could say about a building you built, that it was bigger than your reasons for building it. He had not fixed everything. His life did not look like a picture of a fixed thing. There were still the early mornings when Elena's notebooks sat on his desk, and he picked them up before he remembered he didn't need to check them anymore, and the checking became something else. There were still the moments when Sophie had the sad and working face, and he recognized it from his own mirror. There was still the unresolved grammar of what he and Olivia were to each other, which was real and present, and would take the time it needed to take. He had learned in the years since Elena died that the honest answer to most questions about how you were doing was neither fine nor broken. It was usually somewhere in the complicated middle, where you were carrying things and working and present, and sometimes grateful and sometimes not, and that the carrying didn't diminish the rest of it, and the rest of it didn't make the carrying lighter. And you did it anyway because the alternative was to put down things that deserved to be kept. He thought about what he'd said at the podium. Sometimes you finish the thing because you want to. Sometimes because the world makes it necessary. He hadn't said the third option, which was that sometimes you finish it because someone else started it and trusted you with what they couldn't complete, and the only way to honor that trust is to actually do the work, rather than just holding the intention of doing it. That was the harder version. That was the one that had cost him 3 years of hesitation and one very bad divorce and a custody hearing where he sat still and let things happen to him because he was too hollowed out to understand that stillness and defeat are not the same thing. He understood now. The simulator door opened and Sophie came out, rabbit back under her arm, with the expression of someone who has done a thing and confirmed what she already suspected about herself. "I did the crosswind landing," she said. "Clean? Cleanish. Priya says I overcorrected on the final approach." "Did she say what to do differently?" "She said trust the correction earlier. Don't wait until it's already wrong." Sophie looked up at him. "She says that's the main thing." Logan looked at his daughter. "Trust the correction earlier. Don't wait until it's already wrong." He thought about all the ways that was true and all the ways he was still learning it. "Yeah," he said. "That's the main thing." Sophie fell into step beside him, and they walked back toward the atrium, toward the sound of people in a room that hadn't existed a year ago, toward Olivia, who was probably arguing with someone about the coffee situation with the specific energy she brought to problems that were fixable, toward Janice in his ill-fitting suit, and Priya emerging from the simulator room, and Cole at the turbine display, putting his hand on the housing the same way Logan had the first time it ran. The snow was coming down outside the long windows. Real snow now, the committing kind, the kind that said winter was here and was planning to stay. Sophie stopped at a window and watched it for a moment, her breath making a small cloud on the glass. "It looks like home," she said. Logan stood beside her and looked at the snow coming down on the parking lot, on the building he'd fought to exist, on the town that had held him for 3 years when he needed to be held. "Yeah," he said, "it does." She took his hand, the way she had in the elementary school parking lot 7 months ago when the world was rearranging itself into something new, and she'd decided he needed her hand in his while it happened. He was 33 years old, and his daughter still held his hand in public, and he intended to let her do it for as long as she wanted. They stood at the window and watched the snow, and behind them the building that bore Elena's name filled with the particular noise of something alive. And the turbine on the wall had run clean 5 times and would run clean again. And the work was not done. Work was never done. That was the other thing Elena had written in the margins. The work is never done, it just changes shape. But it was honest. And that, Logan had come to understand, was enough. Not in a small way. Not as a consolation. In the way that honest things are enough because they're real, and real things are the only foundation anything worth keeping can be built on. He squeezed his daughter's hand. She squeezed back. Outside, the snow kept falling.